Davis.
Here.
Councilmember O'Neill.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Big Stick.
Present.
Mayor Beer.
Here.
And Mayor Beer, I can make a few notes about tonight's agenda for meeting format, if you'd like.
Yes, please, Sarah. Thank you.
This meeting is being held by video conference with no physical location open to the public pursuant to the provisions of Government Code Section 54953 as amended by AB 361, which authorizes teleconferenced meetings under the Brown Act during certain proclaimed states of emergency. The public can observe and participate in the meeting via the Zoom link provided in the agenda or by phone to the dial-in number and webinar ID provided in the agenda. The meeting may also be observed live on Comcast TV channel 26 or online at www.cityofpacifica.org/live stream. For this meeting, live verbal public comments may be made through participation by Zoom. This is a special meeting and public comments will be taken only for items on the agenda. For members of the public participating via Zoom, use the raise hand button to indicate that you wish to speak on the agenda item when the mayor calls upon that item for public comment. For those participating by phone, use *9 to raise your hand to request to speak and *6 to unmute once called upon. The city clerk will call upon speakers at the appropriate time and allow each to unmute after called upon by screen name or the last 4 digits of your phone number if dialing in. Please clearly state your full name for the record at the start of your public comment. Written and email public comments will not be read during the meeting, but will be made part of the written record and provided to council members for those received by noon today. Email comments are not monitored during the live meeting. The format of this meeting may be altered or the meeting may be canceled if needed. You may check on the status of the meeting by visiting the city's website at www.cityofpacifica.org for any updates.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'll now read the land acknowledgement. The City of Pacifica acknowledges that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We honor the Ramaytush Ohlone people for their enduring commitment to Mother Earth. As the indigenous protectors of this land and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as caretakers of this place, as well as for all people who reside in their traditional territory. We affirm their sovereign rights as First People and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. We'll now salute the flag led by Councilmember Beckmeyer.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, so tonight we are considering adopting the Sharp Park Specific Plan. And I suppose that we will have our new planning director, Christian Murdoch, with us tonight to help lead that conversation, perhaps our city manager, Kevin Woodhouse.
Yes, good evening, Madam Mayor and honorable council members. I am Planning Director Christian Murdoch. I need a moment here to get our presentation up and running. City Clerk Coffey, there were a few late adjustments, and so if you could allow me to share my screen, I will actually present the presentation in just a moment. And I'm joined this evening by our consultants, Allison Moore and Rajiv Bhatia of Dighton Bhatia. And we also have city staff from the North County Fire Authority and hopefully soon joining staff from the engineering division of the Public Works Department. And additionally, sometime shortly from now, we'll have the Planning Commission's liaison, Vice Chair Samantha Hauser. All right, now I will share my screen.
Thank you, Christian.
And so council, as we know, we are here tonight to talk about the Sharp Park Specific Plan. The Sharp Park Specific Plan responds to the City Council's direction for a revitalized Sharp Park area. It provides guidance for economic development, transportation, land use, and housing opportunities in Sharp Park. and it's a tool for developing a community's sense of place and making vibrant and livable neighborhoods. It will also help facilitate new housing development, which is a critical component to the plan, often including affordable units, and we'll talk more about that during the staff presentation tonight. And it helps the city establish proactive guidelines and can streamline development, and includes more detail to implement the city's land use policies than included in the general plan. The plan that's before you tonight to consider for the City Council is the product of an extensive community engagement process that started in 2019. We've engaged over 1,000 residents, business owners, and others that are interested in participating at more than 20 public meetings. We've held 5 neighborhood workshops, 3 Sharp Park specific planning community meetings, 2 online surveys, City Council and Planning Commission study sessions, and 5 substantive, in-depth, lengthy Planning Commission hearings where the Planning Commission accepted public comment at each of those meetings. At this point, I want to turn over the presentation to our consultant, Allison Moore from Diet and Bate, who's going to talk about some of the specific components, and I'll jump back in a little bit later in the presentation to talk about what the Planning Commission process was like. Allison?
Good evening, Honorable Mayor and Council members. So just continuing on from Christian's presentation, all of that community engagement has culminated in a vision. I will read the vision statement. Sharp Park will become known as a charming Bay Area seaside destination, a magnetic town center for Pacifica, and a complete neighborhood for current residents. The future of Sharp Park builds upon its strengths to achieve its full potential, offering a vibrant, livable, and unique experience for Pacifica residents, businesses, and visitors. Next slide. So one of the most important guiding principles in the plan is to create a vibrant mix of uses along Palmetto Avenue, Sharp Park's energetic spine, to support economic vitality, placemaking, additional housing and commercial development, resulting in an overall land use pattern that represents a complete neighborhood, accommodating of residents of all incomes, family types, and life stages. Next slide. To do that, policies in the specific plan include more intense land uses, including a mixed-use designation along Palmetto, Francisco, and Eureka Square, increased height limits to accommodate additional density and create more room in the building envelope for public amenities, and a ground floor overlay that requires active ground floor uses and design standards to activate the public realm. Next slide. So building on the improvements along Palmetto Avenue that were part of the streetscape project, the mobility chapter of the specific plan focuses on improving connectivity within Sharp Park and the remainder of Pacifica, in addition to improving the public realm. Next slide. A number of policies focus on improving east-west corridors, including Paloma and Clarendon, the 2 gateways at the northern and southern portion of the planning area, and San Jose and Santa Rosa, which connect to the pedestrian bridge and to Eureka Square. To connect to Pacifica and the wider region, the plan emphasizes coordination with Samtrans and linkages with the bicycle and pedestrian master plan improvements, in addition to others. Policies also support other mobility choices and less dependence on cars, as well as maintaining adequate balanced parking supplies for both longer and shorter term parking. Next slide. So in addition to building more complete neighborhoods that are friendly to walkers and bikers, placemaking and creation of a harmonious urban fabric, as well as preservation of what's special about Sharp Park, is also an important guiding principle and one of the highest priorities of the community. Next slide. The urban design and public realm chapter of the plan includes policies and standards for streetscape design, lighting, wayfinding and gateways, public gathering places and green space, building design, which includes height, massing, articulation, building orientation, entries and facades, and parking designs. The plan, to illustrate some of these concepts, the plan includes diagrams and specific guidance on ways that development should be designed to be compatible with smaller adjacent residential neighborhoods, as well as how these improvements can support a feeling of a coastal locale. Preservation of coastal views is also explicitly addressed. Next slide. In addition to appropriate public services and utilities, the specific plan also addresses coastal resiliency. So one of the guiding principles here emphasizes balance of maximized benefits for coastal recreation that the Coastal Commission requires, coupled with protection of public and private investments. Next slide. Policies in the plan are designed to be consistent with the local coastal program, which emphasizes improvement and enjoyment of the coast with those coastal protections. And the plan also emphasizes close coordination with the Beach Boulevard Infrastructure Resiliency Project, which represents a major city commitment to the design of an appropriate seawall replacement critical to the public health and safety of citizens and visitors to Shark Park. With that, I will turn it back over to Christian to talk through what some of the main discussion points at Planning Commission were.
Thank you, Allison. And so as mentioned earlier, the Planning Commission, through the 5 public hearings that it conducted in its consideration and recommendation on the Shark Park specific plan, drilled down into a small number of really critical components. There are a number of changes the Planning Commission recommended, but these, I would say, were the subject of the most extensive discussion and deliberations. The first among those specific points included Eureka Square as one of the largest pieces of property within the Shark Park specific plan area. The Planning Commission recognized that site as having particular importance for the potential future implementation of the plan. The mixed-use center land use designation proposed for the site is really intended to provide a vibrant, dense mix of residential and commercial uses. With that said, the Planning Commission was concerned about residential uses overtaking the commercial uses and potentially resulting in a project that may not have sufficient commercial area. And so as a result, they sought to limit residential development to no more than half of the site area, ensure that any future development at the site includes a minimum floor area ratio or amount of floor area on the site equivalent to the existing commercial floor area in Eureka Square, and then providing density bonuses and height bonuses for projects that include more than that minimum required amount of commercial. And so that made its way into 3 separate policies, 3I23 through 25, contained in the draft document. The key takeaways from these, in the first policy, specifying that residential uses are only allowed on the residential component of the site, which we mentioned is limited to half of the site, requiring that 0.3 or 30% of the site area minimum being commercial uses, of which 20% or 0.2 FAR must be active commercial uses as described in the policy. 3I24, the key takeaway there, this is the incentive for additional commercial area. And so the policies for Eureka Square would set a baseline density of 30 dwelling units per acre and a baseline height of 45 feet. And those densities and heights could increase steadily with additional increases in commercial floor area. And so the intent is to provide incentive through additional residential development to provide additional commercial area, which is important to the specific plan. And so the density could increase up to a maximum of 50 units per acre and 55 feet of building height if additional commercial area is provided. And then it provides an exemption from providing the additional commercial area for projects that are 100% affordable housing projects on the residential component of the site. And then lastly, policy 25 provides an exemption from that process, or an exemption from the limitation of half of the site limited to residential use for a project that exceeds standards and is subject to discretionary design review. And so there's some flexibility built into that policy. The next focused subject of discussion was building heights along Palmetto Avenue north of San Jose Avenue. Prior council direction was to limit building height to 45 feet north of San Jose Avenue as a reflection of the smaller scale and character of that northern portion of Palmetto as compared to the more intensive, larger scale of development that would be suitable for the areas on Palmetto south of San Jose Avenue. As the Planning Commission worked through the plan, I think they were trying to recognize that the provision of affordable housing was also an important policy objective. And so they constructed a policy that would provide additional building height and density for projects that provided affordable housing units. And the way that they did that was to apply this policy to projects that would not otherwise be subject to the city's below market rate housing ordinance. And so what that means is for projects of less than 8 units that do not, I'll get to that in a minute. For projects of less than 8 units, they would be eligible for heights up to 55 feet and densities up to 50 dwelling units per acre with residential allowed on the ground floor if they provide at least 1 unit affordable to low income and 1 unit affordable to moderate income. And so what the result is for those small projects is a higher percentage of affordable housing than our BMR ordinance would provide. And for projects at a smaller scale than we would otherwise be able to require affordable housing to be included. And so it's a lot of text here in this particular policy, but the key takeaways are that this incentive to provide affordable housing and to get higher heights and greater density would not apply to projects that invoke state density bonus, which would entitle them to certain waivers of development standards, and would also not apply to projects that are subject to the city's existing BMR ordinance. The next area of focus discussion was in the buildings at San Jose and Palmetto Avenue. These 3 buildings shown on the screen here, known by a variety of different addresses, which we've included on the screen and in the policy. Public comment and planning commissioner sentiment was that these buildings, while not designated historic resources, had some valuable characteristics in terms of scale, detailing, and so forth that were worthy of continuing on in the Sharp Park specific plan. And so the commission explored a number of ways to achieve that and resulted in a policy that provided alternatives for future projects on those 3 separate lots. These 2 policies were amended or created as a result. The first policy here would ensure that elements of historic age buildings, including the ones specified at San Jose and Palmetto, would be incorporated into new projects to impart the heritage and character of the neighborhood and those historic age buildings. And examples of the desirable elements to include are siding materials, window and door treatments, proportion of facade area as glazing or windows, roofline design, and other similar desirable architectural characteristics. And then the second policy is a bit more prescriptive that a project on either of those 3 lots must retain the existing building facades unless the Planning Commission grants an exemption because the project includes a sufficient amount of architectural detailing that reflects the character of those buildings. And so it's a 2-part process to try to really carry forward the most desirable aspects of those buildings without being overly prescriptive that the entire buildings themselves need to be preserved. The next area of focused discussion by the Planning Commission surrounded the question of building design, site design, and parking standards. As the council, I'm sure, recognizes, on the small sites along Palmetto Avenue, achieving all of the city's requirements can be challenging, in particular, desirable building design and site layout, while also providing off-street parking located on each parcel. And the council, in fact, previously has adopted an in-lieu parking fee for the Sharp Park specific plan area to address just that issue that in many cases, centralized parking facilities will make more sense within the specific plan area. The issue that was subject of discussion by the Planning Commission really came up through a design policy that called for maximum front setbacks, also known as build to lines, of 5 feet, unless some sort of public plaza or public space is provided at the front of a site. That's to help establish the building form and character and scale along Palmetto Avenue. And the policy indicated that not less than 70% of the property frontage should have the building at that build to line. Where the challenge came to light was on narrow sites where they are not wide enough to accommodate a driveway and also achieve the 70% build to line along the frontage. And so in instances where that's not possible, the Planning Commission recommended to put the priority on achieving the build to line and supporting payment of an in-lieu parking fee in those instances where they could not comply with all of those requirements. And then I think the last additional area that we'll talk about for the Planning Commission's focus discussion is on bikeway or bicycle facility improvements. And so Through the plan development process, earlier through the community engagement and decision maker input, we had identified 3 east-west corridors to connect the various areas of Sharp Park to one another for bicycle and pedestrian improvements. As the Planning Commission considered and deliberated on the Sharp Park specific plan, they determined that additional east-west connections, primarily in the central part of the neighborhood, were relevant. I think the fact that the pedestrian bridge at San Jose Avenue is a really critical connection to Eureka Square and areas east of Highway 1 lended Planning Commission support to adding bicycle facility priority improvements to San Jose Avenue as a westbound bicycle facility and Santa Rosa Avenue as an eastbound connection to provide greater circulation through within and throughout the neighborhood. Additionally, the Planning Commission wanted to support future improvements as part of the BBRP project on Beach Boulevard to really push for, if possible, a Class 1 bicycle facility as part of that Beach Boulevard infrastructure resiliency project. So they indicated that improvement of a north-south corridor as well. Through the Planning Commission's review and recommendation, staff attempted to carry forward those various recommendations. We did have the opportunity to connect with the Planning Commission's liaison before tonight's meeting, who identified that we had captured nearly all of the Planning Commission's recommendations, with a couple exceptions, which we'll talk about briefly. And so any City Council action to approve the Sharp Park specific plan, staff would kindly ask that the City Council also include these revisions to the document that's presented in the agenda packet. The first is on packet page 44, page 3-11 of the document, deleting that last line that states ground floor residential uses are allowed on the residential component of the site. That's redundant text to language that's already contained in the sentences preceding. On packet page 53, plan page 3-20, adding a sentence at the bottom as shown here in red line text, residential uses are only allowed on the residential component of the site when the 0.3 minimum FAR is met or exceeded. And then on packet page 96, plan page 5-9, deleting the text when available at the end of, or in the middle of the last sentence. And so with that, we will conclude the staff presentation. We thank you for your time and attention, council members, and we are happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Murdoch. Do we have some questions? I see hands coming up already. So Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Director Murdoch, I sent in just a list of typos earlier today. Did you get them? Do we have to take any particular action to correct those? Were they actually typos?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. We did receive those. Those are quality assurance checks that we'll do when we have the ample time, following adoption of the document. So we will certainly lend our attention to those minor non-substantive typographical errors and correct those in the final document.
Sure. And then, Madam Mayor, I have kind of some questions about the document. I don't know if this is the right time to ask them.
Tiger, it's hard to hear you.
Oh, sorry, I'll lean in. I say I have some questions about the document, but I'm not sure if this is the right time to ask them. Do you plan on going through chapter by chapter or asking it? Okay, cool. I'll hold it for the other side of public comment then.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Bavalos.
And I also sent some changes that a member of the public had regarding the specifics of certain lots that were zoned on the map incorrectly. And are those changes part of this also? I know it was just today, so.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Bavalos. Our team has reviewed those comments that you were kind enough to pass along. Our assessment is that the plan as presented is consistent with the planning approach in the Sharp Park specific plan. And what I mean by that is our attempt to implement the City Council's direction to improve the vibrancy of Sharp Park focused on the north-south corridors, Palmetto Avenue and Francisco Boulevard primarily. We did not look to make changes to the east-west corridors, and the land use designations that are in the Sharp Park specific plan for Salata Avenue, for instance, which was cited in the comments, are reflective of the 1980 local coastal land use plan and reflect the fact that we did not look to make changes to those east-west corridors at this point in time. And so that was one planning approach. And it was one of the principles that we used in development of the plan. And so nothing would change with respect to the status quo in the current local coastal land use plan based on those land use designations.
But what he was saying was that one of the buildings is currently a 6-unit building, and it's shown on the map as a single family. So
it's possible there could be an error in the existing land use diagram. That is not a policy component of the document. It's an informational component. We can revisit that, and if there's a technical error, correct it before we finalize the document. I think more to the point, forward-looking is whether any of the land use policies would be contrary to future redevelopment of the site. And in fact, there's a policy in the Sharp Park specific plan already that would allow sites that are that exceed the allowable density to redevelop at the existing density, even if the policy called for lower density. So the property owner, in light of that policy, would not lose the ability to continue on with, for instance, that 6-unit apartment complex.
thank you.
Okay, is there any other questions? I feel like I have some questions and want some explanations, but it'll like go into deliberation. So I'll wait till after public comment. Anyone else have any questions? All right, let's see if we have some public comment this evening. Elizabeth, are you helping us with public comment? Wonderful, thank you.
Mayor, at this time we have one hand raised.
Okay.
Couple of hands coming up.
Good.
Would you like me to call on the first commenter?
Yes, please.
All right. Christine Bowles, you'll be our first speaker, followed by Tom Thompson.
Good evening, council and staff. And I just want to thank you all and our planning commission for all the hard work and vision that has gone into this document. I know the planning commission spent a lot of time reviewing it carefully, and I especially really appreciate the addition of the preservation policies. It's exciting to see this work together, to come together to provide a vision for what this community can become, to increase the vibrancy of the neighborhood, to build the strength of our businesses, and to build some much needed affordable housing. My previous neighborhood in San Francisco had been transformed this way, and we really loved it. And I hope that other residents would be supportive too. It's so nice to have all these things in walking distance to your home and places to build community. So I really want to help make this plan successful so it can actually be approved and built and make sure we serve our existing residents properly too. And I just had a few questions. I know parking is an issue in the area now, especially on sunny days. And I understand the parking in lieu fees to allow denser building. But I haven't really seen that we've identified any specific sites for where parking garages could be built. So I'm just curious about that. And perhaps it's something I missed. And then in the Vision 2025 meeting on Monday, we were talking about commercial spaces that could take more advantage of the ocean views. And I know we focused on the active ground floor, for people walking, but I don't quite understand, with all the ratios and so forth, if there's any prohibition of people opening restaurants or bars on top levels. Because I think that outdoor space is outdoors where, residents and visitors can enjoy the ocean and the sunsets would really bring more money and vibrancy to this community also. And then I'm glad the fire department is here, and I would just like to hear from North County Fire as to what we need to do to make sure that our fire department can properly serve these buildings up to 55 stories. I met a couple of firefighters in my campaigning recently who said that we didn't actually have a ladder truck here now that could service that. And so just trying to understand what we as a city and the council needs to do to ensure that we have the right support for and budget for these important capital improvements. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
Our next speaker is Tom Thompson. Please state your name for the record.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay. Honorable council members, my name is Tom Thompson, a Sharp Park property owner and taxpayer for 33 years. I submitted more detailed public comments via email. Right to the point though, Sharp Park may need a robust seawall north of the pier someday. The vision of the Sharp Park specific plan is spot on. Visionary, comprehensive, beautiful. It's a good job. Unfortunately, it will never happen without a commitment that Pacifica will protect Sharp Park with a robust seawall when and if sea level rise threatens Sharp Park. I don't see such a statement in the plan. If it's there, please point it out to me. What's the risk? Massive public and private infrastructure, streets, roads, utilities, and public buildings. Over 1,000 of our most affordable homes, 100+ businesses, billions of dollars in public and private critical assets are potentially at stake. Homeowners and small businesses have their nest eggs in retirement invested in Sharp Park. Pacificans who never dreamed their city might possibly abandon them if sea level rise calls for a robust seawall north of the pier could be damaged significantly. Then there are tax streams to fund city government, the pumping plant making sewer service available to 40% of Pacifica, a pier and a golf course, plus the social equity issues of affordable access to beach, golf, coastal trails, and a fishing pier. The Sharp Park specific plan needs a clear policy statement that Pacifica will do all it can to protect Sharp Park if sea level rise threatens. Otherwise, nobody will ever make the investments that Sharp Park specific plan envisions, especially a hotel on Beach Boulevard that will provide a steady, dependable income stream to fund city government. Why would they? And why would lenders fund the projects? The Sharp Park specific plan needs a statement like this one. In the event that sea level rise threatens Sharp Park, Pacifica is committed to making every effort to obtain design, funding, approval, and construction of a robust seawall to protect public and private infrastructure, homes, businesses, and property. Honorable council members, you need to include such a statement in the Sharp Park specific plan tonight. Thanks for listening and for your service to Pacifica.
Thank you, Tom.
Mayor Beer, there are no other comments at this time. Oh, there are some hands that just popped up.
Yeah, let's give them time tonight.
Mayor, I did want to correct one of the speakers said 55 stories and the fire department can't handle that. I want to correct that it is 55 feet, not 55 stories.
Thanks.
We'll go first to Kimberly Williams, followed by Robin Renils. Kimberly, please state your name for the record.
Hi, this is Kimberly Williams with the San Mateo County chapter of Firefighter Foundation. Thank you, Mayor Beer and City Council members and staff. I appreciate that this has been a really difficult and challenging process. And, you know, there's no doubt that sea level rise issues related to sea level rise are challenging for all of us. We recognize that, and we know that there's no one size fits all solution for anything. Within this plan, you know, we've made multiple comments, community members and Surfrider, and attended multiple meetings. And I think you know how the community feels. There are many good things in this plan. but I think they're overshadowed by the things in this plan that still need to be addressed. And part of the reason you've landed on this plan is that there are pieces of it that are driven by private interest and investment and not the public and environmental good. It reinforces some of the same solutions and actions that have created the very challenges we're seeking to address. Sea level rise resiliency and environmental and cultural sustainability rely on embracing new, less damaging solutions. Adapting to sea level rise over the next few decades will be that much harder if new development continues in high-risk zones and planning and preparation don't begin now, so that Pacifica will be ready and not caught in another series of emergency declarations and actions because you kicked the can down the road a little further. Moving utility and sewer infrastructure takes years of planning. It's like going to the dentist, right? If you wait until you have a cavity, you've waited too long and you experience pain and you pay a lot more than if you had gone consistently before. Surfrider continues to encourage the City Council to engage in long-term advanced planning and vision for sea level rise, including planning for landward migration and moving utility and sewer infrastructure out of high-risk areas as these come due for repair and replacement. And of course, some of these issues will be guided by the California Coastal Commission because ultimately they'll have to weigh in on these things. So ultimately, what will Pacifica be without its beaches? A lot of these decisions are going to impact whether we have beaches going forward. And this is not, the sky is falling rhetoric. This is based in science. So Surfrider wants to be a partner and collaborate on solutions. And we encourage you to do the best that you can to look to environmental and public good in these decisions and to engage in advanced planning.
Thank you. Thank you, Kimberly.
Our next speaker is David, who will be followed by Cindy Abbott. David, please state your name for the record.
David, are you there? Sometimes it takes a minute to connect. Do you see them trying, Elizabeth, or?
I see that they're unmuted.
Okay.
Would you like me to go to the next speaker and come back to David?
Yes, please. Yes, David, we'll come back to you after the next speaker, so please hang in there.
Cindy Abbott, please state your name for the record.
I'm Cindy Abbott, a West Shore Park owner resident. In 2019, I was excited to hear that the city was going to undertake the development of a Shore Park specific plan. The process that has taken place and the draft being reviewed tonight has unfortunately become my deepest nightmare for the unique neighborhood that I've called home for more than 25 years. The document is full of contradictory statements about the interest to preserve the historic character of the area while completely changing current zoning, turning full blocks into multi-residential housing and allowing buildings of 55 feet in an area that was once, and in many places still are, cottages that dotted the sandy dunes and still existing small one-way streets. This dramatic, full-throttle redevelopment of West Shore Park is apparent when one does a side-by-side review of the current and proposed land use that dramatically changes the small, quaint area to an area of intensified land use. The draft plan, if approved, will create ongoing headaches for everyone for many years, as it proposes significant changes to the area while ignoring that development must conform to the 1980 local coastal plan, as the city of Pacifica has repeatedly ignored significant and appropriate concerns raised by the California Coastal Commission. In no less than 8 letters from the CCC, specific concerns about the coastal zone have still to be adequately addressed. Of these comment letters, they noted the need to thoroughly analyze potential visual impacts of development, specifically calling out the proposed maximum height and intensification. The Coastal Commission recommended a reasonable approach to include visual simulations, height, and density. I've called this out too. A very small step was taken a while back to show what Palmetto would look like. However, they did nothing to show the impact on the entire area. The Coastal Commission requires the review to be based on the 1980 plan that controls intensification to protect the unique qualities and contributions of existing neighborhoods, and notes that the impact of future development on the open appearance and character of Pacifica's coastline could be substantial. Building 5-story buildings, even with setbacks, does not fulfill this quaint vision of a coastal area. Changing the land use designation for almost every block in this small established area will completely and irrevocably damage the charm of the area. I encourage the City Council to go back, to put a pause on this, to do the right thing, work with the Coastal Commission to certify the local coastal land use plan, and then come back to this program for Sharp Park. And please retain the character. This plan does not do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy.
We'll next go to David again to see if we can connect. We followed by Robin Renils.
David, there you go. Hello, David.
I'm actually being heard. Wonderful. Okay, it's always a mystery why these things happen. Am I able to be heard?
Yes, you are. Please go.
Thank you. Yes, I apologize. I was through some technical trouble earlier. I had CC'd the comments that I had sent to some commissioners to staff as well. But I did confirm that staff did receive it about half an hour ago or so, maybe a little longer than that. Just to focus directly, and I am representing 6 owners here. I'll try to compress this in the very limited time in 2 separate areas. I noted Christian mentioned that there was no focus on east-west, but in the graphics that we showed you, you can clearly see that if you look at the existing versus the proposed, there are dramatic changes on all of the east-west avenues. So I'm a little puzzled as to what he meant by that there were no focus, that there was a very substantial changes from the very pockmarked change, isolated zoning that exists to a rather general plan designation to exist to a very rational one. So my focus is on Santa Maria and on Salada. And as you can see on Santa Maria, that is the 6-unit building is designated now as a single family, or that's proposed to be designated. It is not now designated that, but it is proposed to be. So that's obviously an error. And it is entirely surrounded by 6 high density to very high density uses, including the MUC, whereas the owner with the single lot is a single family. Again, that's obviously must be an error. And so we're asking that be rectified to reflect what all of its neighbors are, which is very high density or too high density. That one is a little bit easier. The Salada one is a little bit more complex because there are 7 properties, not 6, that presently have high density uses in terms of their buildings and or in 3 cases, single family homes like the Panisi one that was recently built and approved that required the high density in order for the R3 to be affected. It's still a single family home, and that's what 2 of the adjacent lots are proposing to do presently. In fact, one already has an application in and one has been working for the last year on an application. So we're just looking for consistency and for a rationale that comports with what you've done elsewhere on all the other blocks, but in these 2 cases. So with that, I see my time is wrapping up. And as I said, I did send that in to staff earlier, and so they can peruse that as well. Thank you for your time.
David, could you give us your full name, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, Beaumont, Beaumont.
Thank you so much.
Sure, you're welcome.
Next, we have Robin Renils, followed by Robert Hutchinson. Robin, please state your name for the record.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, it's Robin Renils, resident of West Sharp Park since, 1976. Property owner, raised my kids here. My mom lived here 3 generations. First, I want to thank the City Council for holding this meeting and for the consideration of adopting the plan and the work of the Planning Commission. I've sat through every single meeting and although with the general plan also, and it's incredible work that they've done, very detailed. I don't think they missed a thing. Obviously, some people do think, but I really feel that for the best of the neighborhood and the plan itself, I feel that they did an excellent job and they should be commented. I would like to say first that I agree with a comment of Mr. Tom Thompson about a statement about the seawall. That seawall will be needed, and it's not the promenade. It will need to be a real seawall. That will be needed in order for success of this neighborhood to go into the future, or for any of these plans to be even worth all the time that we've been putting into this, all of us. And I'm hoping that you can put a strong or bright statement in there stating that, basically what he read to you. I agree with what he said. If you can put that in, that would be, I think that's very, very important. I know it's not going to make the folks that sound like they work for the Coastal Commission happy, but the people who live here and want to preserve and see the future and have investments here want to stay here. And we want to see the neighborhood and Pacifica as a whole survive. We don't want to see the loss of an entire neighborhood like this affect the entire town, which it would. So please put it in. And if you can't put it in, could you please someone explain why it can't go in? Please tell us. All right. And then the other thing is, I agree with something Cindy Abbott said. I have concerns about the height limit in certain areas. And yeah, I don't want to overtower the cottages. We've got some incredible examples of what we want the future to be here, which the Planning Commission duly noted, and it's outlined there. But I also feel that the Planning Commission addressed it, and that I think that they saw the concern and heard the concern of Cindy and myself and other people that live here about the height limitations. So other than that, I really hope that you adopt it. I hope that you take into consideration, and I know you will, all of our comments and carefully decide what is the best for the neighborhood. And ultimately, if you decide to put this in, and please add, you can, something about the seawall, I personally will make sure we march to the Coastal Commission meeting to defend our right to have this neighborhood protected. This is not just for the people that live here. This is for all. Thank you so much for your time and your hard work.
Thank you, Robin.
Next, we have Robert Hutchinson. Please state your name for the record.
Robert Hutchinson, West Shore Park.
Hello.
Hello, Mayor Beer. How are you?
Good, thank you. Go ahead.
Well, I'm speaking tonight because Robin Renels asked me to, and she's been a staunch defender of Sharp Park, West Sharp Park, and Fairway Park for many years, protecting it against flood and famine and you name it. No, really, flood from the seawall. We would have gotten a lot more floods if it wasn't for some of her work and pushing for that. So, as I don't know all the specifics of this plan, I'm taking Robin's word for it that it's worth it, and I back her up 100%. So I agree with her. We need a real seawall, not just a promenade. And I mean, West Shore Park, if you look at pictures from 1900 or before, the coastline has not eroded backwards. It has not eroded eastwardly really at all, as opposed to the cliffs up by Esplanade. Those things, so you'll never stop those 50-foot high sand cliffs. We don't have sand cliffs here. West Sharp Park, so the seawall is not that big of a deal there. They can stop it in the whole country of wherever it is, Denmark, is it? With the windmills, they can stop a couple hundred feet of sea from coming over the seawall here. So that's all. Great seawall, and great job, Council. See? Good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mayor Beer, we have no other hands.
Okay. Taking a breath before I close public comment. All right, we can close public comment now and bring it back to council for questions and deliberation.
There is one more hand.
There is one more hand. We can reopen public comment for that one more hand.
Okay. Calling now on Bob Haxo. Please state your name for the record.
This is Bob Haxo. I'm a resident of San Jose Avenue. In fact, my our cottage was shown earlier in the pictures. I'm concerned about the changes proposed to the streets running along here. In particular, since I live on San Jose Avenue, I'm concerned about the streets, changes in front of my house. And they're talking about like an 8-foot wide sidewalk. And that just seems really pretty much out of character with the neighborhood. And if it is extended on the opposite side of the street, that would be the north side of the street. That's going to suck up where people have part of their yards. And that would be quite unfortunate for them. But I think that 8-foot wide sidewalks is just a little overdoing it. It's not even 8-foot wide along Palmetto. And the other thing I'd like to say is if you want to make it safe for bicycles here and for cars, somebody could manage to figure out a way of keeping cars from going up the street the wrong way. There's too many cars going up these streets the wrong way. I don't know why they do it, but they certainly do it. And I see it routinely. That's my only comment. I thank you very much.
Any other hands, Elizabeth?
No other hands.
Okay, we will close public comment again and bring it back to council. Okay, who's going first? Go ahead, Tiger. Mayor Pro Tem.
Happy to follow. Can you hear me? I'm happy to follow up on some of the community questions to get us started if no one else wanted to jump in. And before I do that, Elizabeth, it is great to see you back here. Welcome home. There you are. So let's start with seawall a little bit. And for staff, why is there a reason why we might not put stronger nomenclature into this document as to our commitment to seawall? And you are muted. Thank you.
Unmuting would help. Thank you. I'll start. So I'm sure the council and the public will remember the local coastal land use plan update process, including the preceding sea level rise adaptation planning process. They were very challenging for the community. The city council ended up with policies that a majority of the council supported in the local coastal land use plan that was sent to the Coastal Commission for certification. And I think it was staff's desire not to be redundant and not to repeat the process and not to mire the Sharp Park specific plan and essentially relitigating those difficult conversations that affect the city overall that were already resolved by the city council in LCLUP update process. And so our approach to coastal resiliency issues was to defer to the applicable policies of the local coastal land use plan, which remain in effect as you harmonize the Sharp Park specific plan with the local coastal land use plan.
Thank you. Ties into a question I'll have later regarding I can find where I wrote it down. Local coastal land use plan. It'll tie into a question I'll have later about there's a statement about amending the LCP once the changes are made to this document. So I don't know if this is the time to address it or not. I was trying to kind of stick to public comment, but I feel like this ties in. So can you maybe give me a headline as to what it means that we will have to amend the LCP later if we approve this document, if I got that nomenclature even right, and if that ties into this greater discussion about whether or not we should emphasize that we support the Beach Boulevard Resiliency Infrastructure Project? Thank you.
Sure. As a basic matter, for any of the city's land use regulations to apply within the coastal zone, the city needs to obtain Coastal Commission certification of those policies. Currently, the city has a 1980 local coastal land use plan, which has been certified by the Coastal Commission, and a number of amendments to that plan over the years since 1980. That is the land use plan that remains in effect. In effect, it's the general plan for the coastal zone, if you will. And it was consistent with the 1980 general plan up until the point that the City Council adopted the 2040 general plan last month. Fast forward to 2020 from 1980, and the City Council approved the certification draft local coastal land use plan and directed staff to submit that to the Coastal Commission to achieve certification. We are still working on that process. As of this month, the Coastal Commission finally accepted our application as filed. And so now the statutory timelines for the Coastal Commission's review of that application have begun. Those include a 90-day requirement to take it to public hearing, unless the Coastal Commission grants itself a 12-month extension to that timeline. And so we are working through that process currently. The question of certification of an amendment is somewhat of a moving target. And what I mean by that is when we started the Sharp Park specific plan process, and by adopting the LCLUP update in 2020, we had assumed we'd be much farther along, perhaps having that document certified by this point in time. And there would be minor additional amendments to that 2020 LCLUP to incorporate the more specific policies of the Sharp Park specific plan. I think it still makes sense to pursue certification of the 2020 local coastal land use plan first, given that it's a major change to the 1980 LCLUP, and it provides a lot of baseline policies, including coastal resiliency policies that we spoke about a moment ago. However, there's no mandatory requirement for that order to necessarily be the case, and there's a potential that, given it's a narrower scope, that the Sharp Park specific plan, in theory, could proceed more quickly, potentially, through the LCP certification process with the Coastal Commission. I suspect that we will submit this upon City Council approval to have 2 concurrent LCP amendments running, and we will see which one concludes first. In either case, we either need to do the comprehensive amendment to the 1980 LCLUP to incorporate the 2020 LCLUP, or we need to do a more narrowly tailored LCP amendment to incorporate the Sharp Park specific plan. So it's a very roundabout way of explaining a very complex process that is uncertain and out of the city's control with respect to LCP amendment and certification.
I appreciate you bringing some level of comprehensibility to a complex problem. So I'm going to poke at just a little bit more so I can try and understand to the best of my ability. So what I think I just heard you say is, either way, if we pass this, we'll have to kind of conform it either to the 1980 LCP or the updated LCP. Did I get that part right?
In the simplest sense, yes. Either we will be amending the 1980 LCLUP to say, hey, we have these newer, more specific policies in the Sharp Park specific plan. Or, and that will be, I think, maybe the more challenging of the two, because there is somewhat of a disconnect between broader policies in the 1980 LCLUP and the more modern focused policies of the Sharp Park specific plan. The alternative is that we will achieve certification of the 2020 LCLUP and be making relatively minor amendments to that to incorporate the Sharp Park specific plan. The difference between the 2020 LCLUP and the Sharp Park specific plan are much smaller than the difference between the 1980 LCLUP and the Sharp Park specific plan.
Tiger, can I just interrupt you for 1 minute? Because I have a question that's very relevant. I just want to be sure I understand it. So Christian, am I understanding you correct in that we submitted the 1980 and we got it certified and that's the law, but now the 2020 LCUP, is it considered an amendment to the 1980, or is the 1980 gone and 2020 is the new law?
Sure. I think it's a bit of semantics. I think I would use different terms. We need Coastal Commission certification of our policies in order for them to take effect. I think people call them amendments when they're relatively small changes, right? So maybe we're changing one parcel's land use designation, for instance, as an amendment. I'm not sure amendment necessarily makes as much sense when you're talking about a comprehensive replacement. But in either case, it's an amendment, it's a replacement. whatever you call it, it needs certification from the Coastal Commission, which is really the operative issue in order for it to take effect in the coastal zone.
Okay, so we are just amending the 1980 plan with the 2020 plan at this point, and then submit this if the council approves. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Tiger, I just want to be sure I was clear.
Sure, and Councilmember O'Neill, just to maybe use your terminology, we would be amending in its entirety the 1980 LCLUP, as opposed to a narrower amendment that might implement a particular change in land use designation, for example.
So getting back to this question of more robustly putting language in about the seawall in this document, I think what I heard you say was, right now as we're in the process of figuring out which document we're adapting this document to, we already have policies in the update that very clearly, robustly state that this is the city's direction. And to incorporate such language in this document being the SPSP, that might actually muddy the waters, where what we are trying to accomplish is very clearly state this is the approach we're taking to protect ourselves.
I think that's exactly, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you very much. I spent a lot of time on that one question, and I have plenty of other comments to follow up on. If anyone else wants to ask, though, please. Okay. So going down the list.
I was depending on you to look at the public comments and ask those questions. So
keep going. If anyone wants to jump in, feel free. So parking garages, did we make an effort to identify a site where we might put a parking garage?
Not specifically. I think the staff intention is to try to seek joint use parking facilities given the significant expense and the scarce land area in Sharp Park. What I mean by that is there has been consideration of opportunities potentially to have a joint use parking garage as part of the 2212 Beach Boulevard project or as part of the library redevelopment or both. Opportunities remain to seek other places to construct parking facilities, but in reality, I think those are probably the two most promising, given that they have project concepts, they are sites under the city's control, they logically make sense given their centralized location to provide common parking facilities. And so I think that's likely to be where the energy and effort will be from the city staff's perspective, unless the council feels a different direction makes more sense.
I've also noticed that Vice Chair Hauser from the Planning Commission has joined us. So I want to say welcome to her. And as I go through some of these questions, if something occurs to you that might be helpful, please. This question is to you also.
Tiger, I'm just asking out of respect because you said we could just come in, and I wanted to ask a question about parking in lieu. You just covered that. I don't mean to be butting in, but you know what I mean.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, Christian, I just want to be sure. I know we had talked about raising our in lieu parking fees. Have we officially raised our in lieu parking fees, and what amount is that? And or is it possible? Do we need to do a separate parking in lieu fee just for this area, like we did in Rockaway?
Yes, Councilmember O'Neill. So the City Council has already adopted an in lieu parking fee for the Sharp Park specific plan area. And so that fee is in effect. It's indexed to, I think, construction costs index. So there is a mechanism to step it up, which was missing from the original Rockaway Beach parking fee, as you may recall. The specific amount, I will have to pull up the resolution, but it's something around $40,000 if memory serves per space. That's the maximum justifiable fee. Individual requests for payment of the fee in lieu of providing parking need to be approved by the city, and the City Council can approve a lower amount, and in fact may want to for certain types of land uses as an incentive, and may want higher per space fees for other land uses as well. So the council retains some amount of discretion with the actual amount of fee payment for a particular use, but keeping in mind that each reduction may run at cross purposes to actually accruing enough money to construct the improvements. And so it's a delicate balance for the council.
City
Thank you, Christian.
Has appeared.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to add and perhaps Mr. Donguinez from Public Works might have the exact figure, but I do believe that the maximum chargeable amount when we considered the park in lieu fees was higher, at least for Rockaway Beach area. And I think for Sharp Park, it was more in the 70,000. And I think the council did already adopt more of an average of and lower in the 40s, as Mr. Murdoch said, but we can double check that.
Well, I just want to be sure we don't end up with the idiocy we had in Rockaway Beach. And I just want to be sure that's addressed, and, you know, both for the council's edification and the public's knowledge also. So, and then that is put in a lockbox, right? So it's not spent on other issues.
That's correct. It's intended for parking related improvements.
Tiger?
I'm done, Tiger. Thanks.
And Madam Mayor, the adopted maximum per space fee at the time of adoption in 2020 was $40,260 per space. I do not have the figure readily available for what the maximum allowable justifiable fee would be, but the City Council maximum adopted was that amount.
Okay, thank you.
Ronnie, since you brought up the parking and loop.
Tiger, you're gonna have to lean in.
Yeah, I can do that. Since you brought up the parking and lieu fees, I know that I read that there is an opportunity to maybe tweak how we use the parking and lieu fees to maybe bolster infrastructure such as bike infrastructure, especially I took it as bike racks, that kind of thing. What's the mechanism of that? Is this the time to start contemplating making those changes, or are you putting it there for down the road?
So a fee other than the fee that's adopted for in lieu parking would require a separate fee study and separate adoption by the City Council. That is something the council would need to direct staff to undertake, probably as part of the annual goal setting process. And we would want to make sure that we have sufficient policies in the document to really make clear what the requirement is, what the exaction is from developers as part of a project to then implement an appropriate fee for that purpose.
Thank you. I actually really liked this comment about the notion of there being commercial spaces not on the ground floor, and I was wondering if you might be able to address that briefly. Is that something that could come?
It certainly is. There's nothing in the Sharp Park specific plan today that would prevent commercial uses above the ground floor. What we have done is really sought to require them along Palmetto Avenue on the ground floor and to make those active commercial uses and to allow residential use above the ground floor, for example. But commercial uses could comprise some or all of stories above the ground floor as well, again, to achieve those ocean views, for example.
And I think I imagine we'll spend a little bit of time talking about height and what that means for this area. But the next question was serving fire needs up to 55 feet. Have we checked in with the fire department? Does Deputy Fire Chief Kavanaugh have any insights he wants to lend, et cetera?
Well, good afternoon, Council. Thank you for having me. So to the question on the aerial that we have, the aerial ladder for Pacifica that we have is housed and stationed up at Station 95 in Davie City on Edgemont. That is the 107-foot tiller aerial platform that we have that is used for the entire JPA for North County Fire for Brisbane and Pacifica. So it is up the road. When it comes to height, depending on if it's commercial or a residential, is anywhere from 10 to 12 feet. And there's a lot of factors that go into play when you're talking about an aerial platform. You have setbacks from the road from the street to what the structure is compared to the angles of inclination for the aerial itself. So there's multiple factors that take place when we look at position of aerial ladders and how far a ladder can reach. There's a formula. It'd be hard to explain how the formula is done, but essentially if you have a street and you put the truck at the street, and let's say you have an offset of 50 feet to reach the building, well, that's one angle. So it's on an aerial ladder. It's a right angle that you look at because you have the distance you have to go from where the placement of the vehicle is or the truck to the distance to the structure off the setback to how high the story is. And from that, you got to remember that the angle, even though it's a 107-foot ladder or 100, even 100, whatever it is, you have angles that you have to deal with, and you have to, so if you're set back, we can't get out 107 feet total all the way, all right? So it just depends on the type of building that we're in, the placement, the parking, the height of the stories, and a lot of those setbacks and inclinations that we have to look at. But we do have a truck that services the Pacifica.
And Deputy Chief Kavanaugh, could you also discuss, in your expert opinion, the relationship of modern building materials and construction, as well as the inclusion in the mandatory requirement for fire sprinklers in these buildings, how that weighs into your consideration of the availability of a ladder apparatus?
Yeah, and that is a great question, and that is something we, as Director Mark, we deal with constantly when it comes to construction. So as we talk about quite a bit with the new alternative methods, 7A construction, which is those alternative methods of materials that are more fire resistant, fireproof. And then also we look at, what type of sprinkler systems we may want to put in. And there are times where people can come in and look at those alternative methods, especially out of the 7A codes, that we can get away with those type of materials instead of having something fully sprinklered. So those are all factors that are taken in when it comes into new constructions. It's stuff that we deal with almost every day in all the areas that we deal with, especially down in Pacifica. And so those are some of those things we can look at.
If I could add to what Deputy Chief Kavanaugh was saying, just to clarify the point, because it's a very important one about fire response. And I think the intent of the question was just simply put, do we have the equipment to respond to this kind of building at that height? And the answer is yes. And that equipment serves buildings that are that high in Daly City. And I think a related point, and Deputy Chief Kavanaugh can elaborate, is the importance of our boundaryless approach to fire response in San Mateo County. So if any specialty equipment is busy at any given time, we have a system that brings it from other communities as well as rapidly as possible. So the short answer, just to clarify, and again, for my brain's clarification, is yes to that answer, or to that question.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Manager Woodhouse. That is correct. Due to the cooperative relationship we have and all the boundary drops and all the responses we have throughout the entire county, if our ladder is busy on an incident and we have a need for one, we get one from one of the other departments and vice versa. That is one of the things that is great about our cooperative relationship we have here in San Mateo County with all the fire agencies. So as we do have, I want to make sure it's as clear, those, like Kevin says, we do have a ladder aerial platform that is available anytime we need for Pacifica.
So to sum it up in a simple way, at least for me, a simple way, on the one hand, anytime we build anything, especially something that would be taller than we're otherwise accustomed, we will make sure to clear it with the fire department to make sure we're in conformance, correct?
That is correct.
And number two, to the best of your ability based on this plan, is there anything here that you're seeing that makes you think, oh dear, that might cause a problem down the road and maybe they shouldn't do that out of a sense of safety?
Mayor Pro Tem, basically, in the plan that I've gone through and looking at some of the heights, and this is why I'd like to say this, clarify. So once again, when you're talking heights on buildings, an aerial platform is only going to be good up to a certain amount, right? Because of all that stuff I was talking about. And that doesn't matter what city you're in. It doesn't matter. So there's always that you have those heights, but we take in consideration some of those other means and ways to build and make sure that the public that are in those buildings are safe, and the fire and especially for fire folks that are going to be responding to those are safe because of those alternative methods in construction that we can look at. So those are all things we take in consideration.
So given that we're hitting it up.
Forgive me. I just also wanted to indicate policy 6-I-4 gets exactly to the heart of your question, ensuring that before approval or construction of 4- or 5-story buildings, that the city ensures the fire authority has the ability to properly service those buildings.
Perfectly, thank you. This question of east-west changes, Santa Maria was referenced, and you might have to help me. I think you might have heard this question clearer than I did, between the single family zoning and the multifamily residence that's there. I think Councilmember Vaterlaus was asking this and it was kind of answered earlier, but I wanted to circle back around since it was asked again, and I want to try and get as much clarity around the point as possible. And there was also mention by that commenter of the 7 properties on Salada and density and consistency. And if you could help me as a novice navigate, please.
Sure. So as best as I understand the comments, I think they may reflect a misreading of the diagrams in the plan. And so one of the diagrams referenced is titled existing land use. And so I think that the commenter may be interpreting that to mean existing land use designation, when in fact it's meant to describe the existing built condition of those properties shown in the diagram, which is not necessarily the same thing as the existing 1980 LCLUP land use designation. And so I think that's the source of one point of confusion as I understand the comment. It's possible that existing land use diagram contains an error, and we will certainly review the properties that were mentioned to ensure that we correct any factual errors. But I think it's a misinterpretation of the information being conveyed by that diagram. And so as I mentioned earlier in tonight's meeting, when you actually compare the existing land use designations in the 1980 LCLUP, we have not undertaken any changes to those east-west residential streets from those land use designations that are in the 1980 LCLUP. And so to whatever extent that there may be dissatisfaction with what those are, they don't reflect any change that's proposed in the Sharp Park specific plan and reflect the status quo that's been in place since 1980. So that's the best description and summation of the issue at hand and what might be able to be done about it.
Thank you. The 8-foot sidewalks on San Jose was one question, and that commenter also had questions about addressing folks going down the street the wrong way. And does this plan address that? Thank you.
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem, I'll take your last question first. And I remember when you were a planning commissioner, you expressed the same observations and concerns given your past experience in the Sharp Park neighborhood. I don't know what a plan can do to address people failing to observe traffic directional signs that indicate one-way streets. There may be additional ways to visualize that. That's really in the purview of the city engineer in accordance with the manual for uniform traffic control design. So perhaps Senior Engineer Dunkinas can talk about what options there are to make a more prominent visualization of the one-way. And I'll give him a minute to think about that and maybe we can circle back. With respect to, actually, could you repeat the first part of your question, Mayor Pro Tem?
8-foot sidewalks down San Jose.
San Jose, yes, thank you. And so, Ms. Moore, are you able to bring up a diagram that shows that that section on San Jose? Really what the diagram is trying to do is to emphasize the importance of those east-west pedestrian and bicycle connections, which were emphasized in a variety of community engagement settings and in the Planning Commission's extensive deliberation. I think it reflects in part maybe a misreading of the plan, which we'll get to in just a moment. And also,
I'm not able to share my screen. If someone could enable my screen sharing. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, thank you. And so I think also we do need to reflect the fact that one thing the commenter said was true, which is that there are a variety of encroachments by property owners into the public right-of-way that they may perceive as their front yards when in fact they are right-of-way owned by the city. And so that is a point that we do want to raise for the council to consider and to weigh that policy consideration as to whether we really do want to drive towards these improvements to serve the greater good in terms of safe pedestrian and bicycle circulation, or are we concerned about, removing encroachments by property owners into the right-of-way? So with that, Ms. Moore, can you walk us through the diagram?
Yes, so this diagram shows the width of existing segments as well as the proposed segments along San Jose Avenue, and an extension of the sidewalk to 8 feet is proposed on the northern side to provide that connection to the pedestrian bridge. But there is no change proposed to the width on the southern side of San Jose.
Thank you.
I think it may be vice versa, if I'm remembering the configuration of that intersection correctly. But in either case, it's 8 feet on one side and 6 feet on the other. and reflecting the improvements in that sense.
Okay, so just to be sure I understand correctly, that extra half of it, that would be taking out what somebody perceives to be their front yard or whatever?
That's correct, Councilmember O'Neill. So the city right-of-way is, in many cases in Pacifica, including the case on San Jose, wider than the built street and often wider than the improved sidewalk space. And so over the years, owners maybe unknowingly have encroached into the public right-of-way with fences, walls, other landscaping types of improvements that if these improvements were to be made, the city would need to remove those encroachments from the public right-of-way and go through a process with the property owners to do so.
And forgive me, Christian is correct.
Thank
It's
you.
on the southern side that connects to the pedestrian crossing right here.
Thank you, Ms. Moore.
And so do we know how many properties this would affect? I'm very concerned about that, about the encroachment.
I don't believe we have a specific number as we haven't surveyed the area. I think we've made a preliminary assessment that multiple properties are likely to have encroachments. And so that would be part of a more refined engineering assessment if the city were to pursue a project like that in the future.
Can you give me the policy number for that again? For when we get to that, it's in chapter 4, right?
Ms. Moore, I think you may have the document up if we could just take a moment.
Yep. So the specific east-west improvements are included in table 4.3, packet page 71.
Thank you.
And then the policies.
Yeah, chapter 4. Okay.
Is there state regulations or whatever to have, how wide does the street have to be passable by vehicles, parking, and bicycle lane?
Mr. Dungeness, are you able to speak to what those minimum engineering standards are and to also comment on the MUTCD considerations?
Yes, good evening, council and public. My name is Raymond Dungeness, Senior Civil Engineer with the City of Pacifica. Regarding the one-way street, San Jose, I know that on some of the streets, we have do not enter signs along with the one-way signs. We will review the other streets that are one-way and add the one-way or do not enter signs accordingly to make sure that the public knows not to enter those streets the wrong way. But I will get back to you regarding the minimum widths for the travel lane. Right now, I think for passenger vehicle, it's between 10 to 12 feet for a regular one-lane street.
If I may also quickly add, this issue was actually discussed pretty extensively by the Planning Commission. At one time when we went to the Planning Commission, we did not have the extra 1.5 feet on the southern side, reclaiming the city right away, but we had narrower parking strips. And Commissioner Hauser may be able to comment on that. We had 6-foot wide parking lanes, which the commissioners felt would not be adequate, and then the cars would be jetting out into the right-of-way needed to safely traverse the street itself. And that's the time we ended up widening it a little bit, which required us on the southern side of the street to go into the places where the city right-of-way does exist. And there are a total of about 10 properties out there. I'm not sure how many actually have any structures that do come up to the street. That's not something I readily remember, yeah. By structures, I mean like fences or things of that nature, not buildings, yeah. Thank you.
Commissioner Hauser.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, Mr. Boccia is correct. So when this originally came to us, the parking spaces were much narrower. And I think what the Planning Commission had felt was appropriate when we first looked at this were 8-foot wide parking spaces, but working really closely with Public Works and talking this through a lot, 7.5 is what everyone felt would be the minimum parking width that would be safe, effective, and feel comfortable. And, you know, provide that extra breath that Mr. Boccia was talking about.
And Madam Mayor, I just want to note that we can consider language for a policy specific to one-way streets and improving signage and other safety measures if that's desirable to the council as one of the specific recommendations in Chapter 4.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if I heard that there's a particular mechanism for addressing the one-way streets within the context of the document. And thank you, Mr. Dungeness, for pointing out that you would look at extra signage. What also occurred to me is, and I might get the acronym wrong, but the local roadway safety plan we're currently working on might also be a good opportunity to bring that to the safety plan that's already underway. My last question in terms of community feedback that I heard, and again, if I don't ask a question that somebody tried to ask, I apologize. I tried to ask what I could hear. The issue of 55 feet structures. And I know that when I was on the Planning Commission, north of, I think, San Jose was where it seemed more appropriate for 35 feet and certainly no higher than 45. And now it seems like there are potentials along that strip for 55 feet. Now, I did watch all of the Planning Commission meetings, and so I have a rough sense of how that was arrived at. Perhaps Commissioner Hauser can chime in, if not Director Murdoch. But it is a concern because going straight to 55 feet does strike me as out of character with the neighborhood. I'm not sure what it looks like when it's stepped back. I'm not sure what more study I would want to feel comfortable. But I want to hear first how it was arrived at that's suddenly a potential that I don't think in the last iteration we were as robustly considering.
Right. Go ahead, Commissioner Hauser.
Sure, thank you. This is something that the Planning Commission discussed a lot. And I think one of the things that we talked about, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of flipping back and forth between the policy and the land use diagram. But if you look at the land use diagram, figure 3.3, there's a lot of MUC along Palmetto. There's the MUC designation at Eureka Square, and then there's the MUC designation on Francisco Boulevard. If you look at the policies, however, if you look at, for example, 3-I-39, Northern Palmetto Density and Height.
Can you give me a page number, please, Sam?
You know what? It's 3-24, and Mayor Pro Tem, I always have a bad habit of doing it in the document instead of the packet. So
I'll figure it out.
Yeah, 3-24 is probably the closest I can give you. But essentially what that says is that, you know, on Palmetto, it heights up to 45 feet. And only when you do affordable housing, do you, like additional affordable housing, do you go above 45 feet? And Mr. Murdoch, feel free to jump in here. For Eureka Square, it also starts at a lower height, which is, if I'm remembering correctly, is 45 feet. And I'm trying to find that policy now. And only by doing additional commercial space do you end up being able to go into 55 feet. So what we looked at are these two things that the city really wants, right? We really want affordable housing to help with the housing crisis and RENA numbers. We really want high quality commercial because that's something that Pacifica needs, and we want economic development. So by using incentives and using the 55 feet as an incentive, it really provides more flexibility. Francisco, I believe, and Mr. Murdoch, please jump in if I'm misunderstanding this. I believe the homes or the land uses on Francisco are the only place where the 55 feet is by rote for MUC.
I think also on Palmetto Avenue, south of San Jose Avenue, up to 55 feet, I don't think is further conditioned on incentives. Mayor Pro Tem and Council, if I could add some additional perspective, very much along the lines of what Vice Chair Hauser mentioned, the City Council's guidance with respect to heights north of San Jose Avenue was clearly understood. They also, however, received a lot of public input about the need for affordable housing. And so in recognition of the fact that the city does not have a significant funding source to support the production of affordable housing, using the incentive of additional height in very narrow circumstances to achieve sorely needed affordable housing, my sense is the commission thought that was one reasonable exception to the other very important policy consideration, which is neighborhood scale, effectuated through the 45-foot height limit. And so ultimately the council will find out where to come down on that issue, but it was really from an affordable housing supportive standpoint that the Planning Commission resulted in that recommendation, which for a project of 7 units, right, which would not otherwise be subject to the city's BMR ordinance, you'd in effect get a 28% inclusionary housing requirement, nearly double the 15% you would get through the city's otherwise applicable standards. So you might go from 0 affordable units to 2 under this particular mechanism.
So,
Go ahead, Commissioner Hauser.
Thank you. There was one other thing that I forgot to mention, and it's in chapter 5. And I'm sure Mr. Murdoch knows the page number better than I do, but the plan does require step backs as well as setbacks from single family residential zoning to create a buffer. So it's not a 0 lot line and all of a sudden it goes from a 15-foot high single family home to a 55-foot building. There are buffers and there are design controls that have been contemplated and built into this document.
And can we see that? I know they asked for visuals about that. And when I watched the Planning Commission meeting, I believe there were some that were brought up on the screen, so it would be helpful to see those again. I am very concerned about this because I thought our direction was really clear. And so I would really like to push back a little bit and see what that would look like in showing our cottages. Like, I don't feel like this does that, but.
Sure. So, Madam Mayor, you'll see hopefully on the screen, this is packet page 110. This is one example of the visualization of the daylight plane, and Ms. Moore perhaps can jump in if she can readily identify some others. And I think it reflects at the rear setback. This is showing a 55-foot mixed-use center building, for instance, near a 35-foot high building to the rear behind it. Conceivably, this could be a single-family residence, right, in the configuration that Vice Chair Hauser mentioned. And it's showing the requirement to step back with the daylight plane, for instance, along the rear of that building to provide some separation and to ensure reduced impacts to shadowing and daylight for the property to the rear, as well as the minimization of that imposing scale that might otherwise result from a box that went straight up, if you will, to 55 feet along the whole facade. Similar approach, but with more articulation and detailing you can see on the top of the diagram here for the front setback along Palmetto Avenue, which I think gets at a different issue, which we might get to, which is that human scale and that smaller scale that's desirable, while also trying to allow the achievement of density, which is really a critical element to the vibrancy that we envision through the plan.
So I recall there was some conversation, and I don't deal with this every day. So something about state laws and exemptions that would allow the developers to build denser regardless of what we tell them they can do. I'm not sure how deeply that played into this conversation, but I seem to recall it being there somewhere. And my other question is, if instead of up to 45, but then we allowed a 55 if affordable housing, what would it look like if we did up to 35, but then we allowed up to 45 with affordable housing instead?
So, Mayor Pro Tem, in large part, what it sounds like you're referring to is state density bonus law, which has a variety of thresholds that a project needs to meet in terms of including affordable housing units. In some cases, as little as 10% for certain types of projects, 10% affordable, I should say. It applies to projects, I believe, of 6 units or more. So very small projects are not subject to state density bonus law. And as mentioned in the policy that the Planning Commission recommended, projects that invoke state density bonus law would not be able to avail themselves of those additional bonuses. But really what's at the heart of, I think, a lot of local communities' fears about state density bonus law is, on the one hand, it is supportive of affordable housing development, but on the other hand, it eviscerates local land use control through the required incentives and concessions that the city has to grant in accordance with state density bonus law, which the legislature determined was necessary to allow additional housing density and additional monetary compensation in return for providing those affordable housing units. The Planning Commission really took care, for instance, in Eureka Square, to try to manage state density bonus law to try to fully achieve, to the extent it can, a balanced commercial and residential site.
I can fully understand Eureka Square, but I am still having a hard time with this section. So I hope that my other council members will chime in as well. Commissioner Hauser?
Sorry, Mayor, I had one more thought on this. And that's when the Planning Commission reviewed this, one of the things that it really looked at were the density ranges that were established in the general plan and that were matched here in the specific plan for consistency. And I think one of the things that we talked, that we felt was appropriate is at the densities that are being contemplated here. So for MUC, 30 to 50 dwelling units per acre. In order to achieve that and have homes that are actually appropriate for families and not just, micro studio apartments, you do need to allow for that additional height potentiality. So that was some of the conversation, although obviously, we report to you, so.
Thank you. Councilmember Vavalas.
I was concerned about Eureka Square because Eureka Square height limit doesn't affect anyone else. And it brings more people who would walk and use Eureka Square. But I think I understand that you're incentivizing them so that they can go higher if they build affordable housing. And all of this is supposing that someone's going to build any of this. So we can only try and change height limits, but we don't build as a city. And so people will have to come in and build these things. And I know that construction is difficult on a neighborhood, but it's not going to happen all at one time. I don't see all of these businesses just saying, okay, we're going to build 5 stories now. It's going to take a long time for this process to go through. So that's just a comment. Thank you.
Councilmember Beckmeyer, it looked like you were going to say something for a moment.
I was going to jump in there. Oh, what just happened to my light? It went away. Sorry. I was going to jump in there in response to the mayor's comments and her request for hearing from other council members. And since I haven't said anything so far tonight, I thought it was the opportune moment to jump in. I share the mayor's concerns. As I look at this plan, I think about the neighborhood that we currently see. And then I look at some of the designs that are in this plan, and I can't help but think about places that we all see when we go traveling over the hill. I've brought this to Director Murdoch's attention multiple times. Areas that have different zoning, that are on a very busy transportation corridor, that being the El Camino. We are seeing boxes that go from street level to the 5th floor with very little attention given to step back, setbacks, changing the look in terms of little decks or things like that. And what I am concerned about is inadvertently creating a condition where that could happen in this neighborhood. I don't know how else to say it more plainly than that. And when I look at this plan and I don't want to disrespect the work that's been done and the work that the Planning Commission has done in terms of delivering, and our staff and our consultants have done in terms of delivering what we asked for. So please understand that I'm not saying, oh, this whole plan is terrible. It's not. It's very good. I just think we need to be a little bit more refined in certain parts of the corridors. I think we did a good job when we were, I forget, when multiple public meetings, when we sort of said, what about 45 feet, north of this street and 55 south? That was a good step. I think when I look at some of the renderings and I realize these are not plans that anyone has put forward, to Councilmember Vatalos's point, it still gives me pause. I'm speaking, for example, and I'm going to refer to packet page 102. When I look at architectural features on that particular page, and I look at this potential building, this doesn't look like the picture on the facing page 103 to me. It doesn't look like the design elements at 1914, 1922, and 1926 Palmetto. When I look at the building on page 101, I have a similar response. Maybe what I need to get over is you can't have a little tiny cottage like this and have affordable housing. And, I think I'm trying to navigate and be respectful to our community who gave us their impassioned feedback and have given it to us multiple times over the months and years that we've been working on this. I'm looking for a way for this council, which is committed to creating more housing in our community and to creating vibrancy in this neighborhood. I'm looking for a way to honor that and continue forward with that. And at the same time, divine some kind of way that our designs can look more like the cottage historic neighborhood that we are hearing about from quite a few commenters, and that we see presently. So how do we do that? I think that's really what I want to hear from staff and consultants. I know it's possible. I just don't know, what's the path?
City Manager Woodhouse.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Beer. And I don't know if my question here will help or not. And what the council's discussing is this tension between, neighborhood character and affordable housing. And perhaps it's a question for Commissioner Hauser as to whether the commission really talked about this in the context of our RENA allocation and the difficult work we have to do with the housing element coming up, and particularly the difficult large number of affordable housing that's required in that. And so this important discussion really weighs on the capacity for infill development for housing, versus the tough issues that are going to rise for potential housing sites elsewhere in Pacifica as well. So I wanted to throw that RENA and housing element pressure variable into this conversation. And sorry if that makes it more difficult.
Go ahead, Commissioner Hauser.
Thanks, and I'll just keep continuing to answer questions when people say my name, but if you don't want my input, let me know as well. Look, so one of the things that was added to this document on packet page, or I don't know what the packet page is, but on 3-16, it talks about Eureka Square redevelopment, which is a 5-acre parcel, and it's MUC, and it allows for a lot of development. It's one of the biggest sites available in Pacifica. And it's contemplated that a site that's that large gets 171 housing units. To City Manager Woodhouse's point, it is going to be very difficult to meet RENA numbers close to 2,000 units when you don't have a lot of sites that are this large. So the question that the Planning Commission looked at was like, well, how do you do this? How do you contemplate this and give the flexibility to the planning department to come with a housing element draft that can contemplate that? So it was taken into consideration. And I think having that number of the 171 units really put into perspective for us on what it takes to get to that large number. So.
Madam Mayor, I think I have a number of points I'd like to make in response to Councilmember Beckmeyer's statements. I think first, I would go back to packet page 110 and explain that, in my opinion, those ground to sky 55-foot high boxes that you alluded to in other communities would not result from this Sharp Park specific plan. The staff, as well as the commission, took great care to put objective design standards in place that would ensure building articulation, ensure step backs along the front and rear of these buildings so that you don't get large unwieldy boxes that are well out of character with the scale and design desired. Additionally, the Planning Commission, just to your point about the character of those buildings at Palmetto and San Jose, right? The three, historic type buildings, if we'll call them that, to bake in two specific policies that really get to the heart of what's desirable about those buildings: the windows, the siding, the detailing, to ensure that that's carried forward into the design of future buildings. None of those diagrams that were referenced are intended to be example buildings. They're intended to depict different characteristics that would result from the policies, but not to be a building design in and of themselves. And so more to the point, those were created much earlier in this planning process and don't reflect the refinement that you would get through the policies that were developed and the design guidelines and all of the comprehensive characteristics that come together in a particular building. The last point I want to make right now is just that you are being asked to decide what the future character is of this neighborhood. There's a lot to like about what we have today, but the council determined, several years ago that it wanted something different, right? And something better. Arguably, it's a loaded word, but what I've said earlier in this process that I'll say again is the 35-foot height limit we've had for 40 plus years hasn't achieved what the council has said that it wants through this specific plan. And so as hard as it is to maybe move beyond that, that I think may be a necessary element to achieve some of the other desired outcomes that the council has espoused, in giving its guidance to staff. And last point for now on height is north of San Jose Avenue on Palmetto. That's not a make or break component of this plan. And in fact, it wasn't an earlier component of the plan. I think the Planning Commission, in my assessment, saw it as a unique opportunity to try through the tools that were available to it to provide for additional affordable housing. But I don't think that that's an essential element of this plan necessarily. And I don't think it's likely to get us well along the way to where we need to be in our arena in the housing element for affordable units, given the very small size of the sites. But it would be indicative of the city's support in every instance for affordable housing, because every unit counts for the families that live in those units. And so that's a policy tension the council will have to weigh and decide, but the plan can retain its integrity without that height above 45 feet north of San Jose. It's just a rare opportunity to try to get additional affordable housing units without direct public financing, for example.
Thank you, Director Murdoch. I appreciate that. Go ahead, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. And I appreciate you articulating it such a way that at least I feel like there's a little bit more flexibility in my decision making within the context that I think I am feeling acutely every unit of what it would take to come to that 1,800 number. And I suspect other council members might as well. Just to flesh out a little bit what our full menu of options is, if instead of having it written here that it's a 45 to 55 with the bonus, what if instead we looked at something like a 35 to 45 instead? What would that look like if we adjusted it that way? Would we lose substantially? Would it be helpful if we did that, comparatively speaking? That kind of thing.
Sure. I think we would need some more time to really think critically through the different variations of that approach. I think my initial reaction is better not to tether an incentive to get from 35 to 45. Probably better to allow 45 as the council had already supported earlier in its guidance. Hope to get more units in each project, maybe up to 8 units or more, and try to trigger the city's BMR ordinance. I think that's probably the more useful way to crack that nut with respect to incentivizing affordable housing development, rather than tethering it to 35 to 45 incentive, which I'm not sure is quite enough density and economic benefit to get there. Mr. Bhatia?
Yeah, I would just like to add that if there were to be a qualified affordable housing project, they would seek a concession, and the city would be compelled to grant them that concession for projects that are larger than 6 units. So what we are talking here really are small projects. That's what we are talking about here, of allowing those projects to have the same benefit that a larger project might. So it comes down literally to a handful of sites. I mean, on page 48 of the package that you have is a list, as a map of opportunity sites. And you can see many of those sites are actually larger sites that would inevitably have more than 6 units on them. So this comes down to, I don't know, Christian, in your mind, maybe it's no more than 3 or 4 sites that, this is what we are talking about, those smaller sites that may get some additional floor as a result, of this,
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bhatia. I'm not sure I can put a number on it, but you do raise another important point, which is that for projects of 6 or more units, they are more readily able to trigger state density bonus law, which really takes the lid off of city control. The backstop in this location is the coastal zone and the CDP requirement and LCP and Coastal Act compliance. And so density bonus isn't quite the sort of unlimited release of local zoning as it might be outside of the coastal zone, like in the Eureka Square context that the commission worked really hard to address. But nevertheless, the presumption is that it would apply, and the city would be on the defensive, if you will, to argue, why a particular incentive or concession would be inconsistent with the LCP and the Coastal Act. Whereas the commission was trying to incentivize projects not to invoke state density bonus law to get these other, benefits available to it in terms of extra height and extra density. So it is an additional wrinkle to this consideration.
So in theory, by keeping in place the 45 to 55, we might actually wind up with smaller projects than if we leave it to fate in terms of a developer invoking state density bonus law.
I think that's one of the indirect incentives for those projects, yes.
Good to keep in mind. Thank you.
Okay.
In terms of community feedback, that was the extent of the questions I wrote down.
Okay. I still would like to come back to this because I just don't think it's fair to our community to not listen to this specific part. There's just one part. We're doing a lot of other changes in other areas. So I really was going to push to keep it at 45. And I'm not sure what to do next, but I do think that we can start going chapter to chapter, and then I'll come back to that. If that's okay with you. Mayor Pro Tem.
Right off the bat, is there a reason why there's no table of contents in this document, apparently?
There's not a good reason. We did include a hyperlinked table of contents in an earlier public review draft, and we will certainly add that into a future draft if the council directs that at a subsequent meeting or in a final approved version if that's where we get tonight.
I'd personally like to see a table of contents.
I would also like to have a 5-minute bio break before we start on the chapters. Just wait another moment for Councilmember O'Neill. Hello. Okay. All right, let's start at chapter 1. Does anybody have any comments or questions in chapter 1? Mayor Pro Tem.
There we go. Breaking up the monotony a little bit of the more difficult questions and knowing we're going to go right back there soon. I did have a question. There was mentioned just in the first chapter on 1-2 about the natives using the water for food, water, and fuel. And it was just a matter of curiosity. What is meant by they used it for fuel?
Sure. I read the construction of that sentence to mean that from the creeks, they pulled the 3 different resources, food, water, and fuel in the form of wood, brush, etc. That's how I read that sentence.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're all okay to go past chapter 1 into chapter 2. Thumbs up, everyone? Okay with doing that? Okay. Chapter 2. Mayor Pro Tem.
I feel like we pretty substantially addressed the question of amending LCP depending on how we fall on this document. There was a similar question about the bike and pedestrian master plan, and I did hear the robust discussions in Planning Commission. So I took that to mean that should we pass this, then it's a good idea to go back to the bike and ped master plan because we might need to tweak it based on the adjustments we made in this document.
Yes, I would agree, Mayor Pro Tem. I don't think there's anything inconsistent with the bike and ped master plan that was recommended by the Planning Commission. There are additional improvements. I think it would be good practice to retroactively amend the bike and ped master plan to be consistent with these additional improvements that are recommended.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I agree with that. Anything else for chapter 2? Chapter 3. Okay, well, I just have one thing, maybe 2. On packet page 52, 3G4, where it talks about the Pacifica Resource Center, it says for any future mixed-use development of the current Pacifica Resource Center, allow the community nonprofit to use of PRC to continue. I'm just wondering if we could possibly strengthen that language to be like continue to full capacity, or I don't know, it seems kind of, is it possible for us to strengthen that language a little bit?
Sure. I think, it sounds like allowing expansions is one component of that. Just to give the brief background on the policy, the mixed use land use designations proposed along Palmetto do not directly allow nonprofit office type uses on the ground floor. And so I think the Planning Commission was sensitive to the importance of the PRC and its uniqueness. And so ensuring there was a policy to support its ongoing use. Granted, it could be interpreted to allow it, at its current scale and range of uses. And really you're trying to allow it in all of its potential future forms is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Yes, please. Thank you. Councilmember O'Neill.
Hold on, I have to flip back to the document that's in another browser. So my cursor has disappeared. Hold on.
You're on mute, Mike.
I'm challenged tonight here. So let's see. On page 43-2, types of commercial uses in Sharp Park. It says visitor serving. Can we add recreation? Because I mean, there is quite a bit of recreation down there between golf course, fishing pier, kind of the archery range, and then if we put in bike and walking and stuff.
Where are you again, Mike?
Yeah, I don't know where you are.
Oh, packet page 40.
Oh.
Land use designations, table 3-2.
I got you. Okay.
And it has community serving, neighborhood serving, visitor serving, and maybe put something like visitor serving / recreational.
So Councilmember O'Neill, the visitor serving description currently includes commercial recreation. Is there some other recreational component you feel like is not adequately addressed in that description?
Well, commercial sounds to me like a paid type of thing. Commercial means, you know, money changing hands and a bowling alley, Pee-wee golf, something like that. But there's a lot of free recreation there, right? There's the pier, there's just walking along Esplanade, there's Sharp Park golf course, which isn't free, but is commercial, but it is a recreation and stuff. And it just feels that the recreation is a component of Sharp Park.
Right. And I think that the confusion, or not confusion, but just the constraints really of changing it here is that the table title says types of commercial uses in Sharp Park. So is there a place to put language that acknowledges the non-commercial recreational uses in the area, or highlights that they exist and will continue to exist? For example, the pier, free fishing, right? I mean, I know that it's alluded to in the plan, but I think that what Councilmember O'Neill is getting to is that we don't want it to sound like we're going to commercialize all of the recreational opportunities in the area. Right, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I think a major draw for out-of-town visitors is the pier and Esplanade, Maury Point. And I don't know if any of those are really commercial, because commercial means to me it's a business, a private business doing something, not a public recreational asset. Maybe I have a different interpretation than everybody else, but.
So I think we may want to consider policies in Chapter 5, for example, to talk about public gathering places and green space. And there are a variety of mentions there of recreational uses and ways to support the physical development of spaces for recreation, including public plazas and other public spaces. When you think about a land use that we're striving to do, and really the focus on the north-south corridors, those are primarily recreation, or rather commercial oriented locations, and that's why the policies that you're reading, I think, are drafted as such. And Ms. Moore, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add that in chapter 7, packet page 140, there are more specific descriptions of what each of those unique coastal resources are. Just offer that.
140, you said?
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Okay, if everybody's comfortable the way it is, I'm okay with it.
And Councilmember O'Neill, for what it's worth, it's sort of a technical response, but when you look at the planning area for the Sharp Park specific plan, it does not specifically include the pier or the golf course or the archery range in East Sharp Park. And so this plan would not directly address any of the land use policies that affect those existing recreational uses. So we would really be thinking about other internal uses to the existing subdivision, for example, throughout Sharp Park.
Okay. I mean, okay. No, that's fine. Next time, okay, then we'll call it the Russell Harkins Pier, or Reverend Harkins Pier.
Actually, thank you for mentioning that, Mike. And I'm sorry, Mayor. I think that I was thinking we should be referring to it by that name. And in the very beginning of the document, it's just referred to as the Pacifica Pier. And I know that's a technicality maybe, because we know what we're talking about.
They do call it Revel Herschel Hawkins Pier in there.
Right, but I'm thinking I gotta find it. I'll look for the reference because I noted it when I was reading last night.
Just open it in PDF and do a search.
You're right, I could do that.
Well, you can also touch back when you find it. Let me know.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. On packet page 56 under the affordable housing 3.6, I know it says in the footnote that the recent comprehensive rent data is not available. Can you explain why it's not available and where do you get it? There's a footnote about the increase in rents.
I can speak to my personal experience, and perhaps Ms. Moore can speak about specific data gathering conducted to prepare the plan. I will say in my prior housing work, it's very difficult to find comprehensive, systematically updated rental data in many cases, particularly for narrow geographies like Sharp Park. And so what I've found in the past is citywide or region-wide rental data. That's a more reliable data source. Ms. Moore, do you have any other familiarity with sources of more granular data that might support Mayor Beer's desire?
We could look at Zillow or Redfin or other types of sites like that to get more of a sense on what rents are. But I don't know how representative that would be of the whole of the area. It would only be available for units that are available for rent, not existing.
The census does collect more comprehensive data, and at the time we did this, the census data had not been published. We could look at Zumper and some other sources, but I'm sure the housing element is getting into that. In any case, this is background text. It's not policy. It's not going to change any policy, even if we had more up-to-date data per se. Yeah.
Well, thank you for saying that, because there is a policy 31-36 displacement indicators, and it talks there about monitoring indicators such as change in share of low-income households, average rent, sales price, and I was curious about how you monitor that and if that type of detail belongs here, or if that would be in another policy discussion we would have sometime in the future, or because I know there's rental registries and things like that we can talk about. I was just curious of what you meant here, how you would monitor it.
I think in my assessment, this policy 3I-36 on packet page 57 does reflect a best case scenario of data you would have to support ongoing assessment of housing related impacts. In particular, the Sharp Park neighborhood, I think, is viewed historically as one of the more affordable neighborhoods. It certainly has a lot of rental housing units, and in particular, smaller multifamily properties in many cases. And so I think there's a sense of wanting to try to protect those and existing occupants. I will note, just as an existing matter of law, displacement that might occur as part of a redevelopment of the property has a number of legal protections in state law, including but not limited to the Mello Act, which requires the city to determine whether low-income persons occupy buildings that are affected by redevelopment, and has certain provisions obligating the property owner to relocate those folks, I believe, within 3 miles of the site in question or the coastal zone more generally. I can't remember specifically. So existing law already does contain a number of protections for displacement in the coastal zone.
Okay, I'm sure we can talk about that more in our housing element anyway, right? Okay.
Correct.
Anybody else have anything for chapter 3? Ready to move on to chapter 4? Once. Okay. I guess the only thing I noticed in chapter 4 was like, I don't see any really discussions about micromobility. I know we talked about, I guess I just don't see the term. And it's such like it's used a lot now.
Yeah, on page 79, there is a reference on 4-I-15. Shared bikes, e-scooters, and all that.
Right, Mayor Beer, the term here is microtransit. The Planning Commission did spend some time talking about those kinds of issues and how to support a variety of mobility options, including electric scooters and bikes, and types of regulations to balance the use of those implements with public safety and how best to achieve that. So Vice Chair Hauser from the Planning Commission might be able to share additional insights, but the Commission did discuss that.
Thank you. If you'd like to add in, that'd be great, Commissioner.
Sure. I mean, I think Mr. Murdoch did a really good job at answering that, and I probably wouldn't add much. Except, I think we spent a lot of time making sure that there were bike paths in appropriate places and thinking about how people get to the pedestrian bridge, adding a bike path that gets you to the pedestrian bridge, even though there's no direct bike access. And then as we were having that conversation, it kind of came up that we needed to have this policy that provided for different types of mobility. So I think Mr. Murdoch said it well, though.
And Madam Mayor, I'll add 2 other points that don't immediately jump out from this policy 4-I-15. One of them is that the Commission did explore whether it was appropriate to put policies that might regulate speed limits and other safety considerations. The consensus ended up being that really was a question for the City Council on a citywide basis through some separate type of ordinance, if that was the desire, to regulate safety of those types of transportation modes. And then in other policies related to the creation of public plazas, some of the required components of that to achieve, I think, some floor area ratio bonuses was the inclusion of electrical outlets. That was one of the options. And so that is supportive, in my opinion, of those e-scooters and e-bikes to allow people a convenient method of recharging those during their daily use.
Okay, good enough. Thank you.
I have a question on this area, and forgive me for not asking it before now. In terms of encouraging private use of things like van pools and that, is there an appropriate place to put that in here? I'm thinking about when Councilmember O'Neill was telling us about the work that's done in the staff housing at Jefferson Union High School District and linking that with existing resources. Specifically, I'm thinking about development in Eureka Square someday. Is it appropriate here to mention that? We do speak a lot to the existing public transportation through Samtrans, but I'm just going to acknowledge what we all know, which is that it's not adequate. And so it feels to me that if we were going to be encouraging a number of housing units, affordable and otherwise, we're going to need to be encouraging, if not requiring, some kind of support to get people to transit hubs. And I don't think Samtrans is it. I mean, maybe that will change. Let's hope. I know we're seeking to have that happen. We're looking for seamless transportation and these issues, but it's not gotten better over the last few years. So roundabout way of saying, do we need to insert something in here, or is that covered at another point in the process?
Christian, isn't that kind of related to this being a priority development area? That if there is increased population and we want to do it, don't we actually get some extra funding for some stuff?
Right. So there, I think, are a number of ways that the Sharp Park specific plan and the PDA and other elements of existing law come to bear on this issue. The priority development area is one tool. I think it's a little less clear because all of the funding opportunities are not always known at this point in time, but there are additional funding opportunities where we can get to a critical mass and improve transportation service and headways and so forth for existing transit. But those are very expensive and somewhat longer term solutions to Councilmember Beckmeyer's point. One element of existing law that applies through state law through the congestion management program requirements for each county are that CCAG, the City County Association of Governments, administers the county's transportation demand management program. And so that's a fancy word of saying implementing measures like bus passes, van pools, increased bicycle parking and other site-specific design and operational components to give people convenient alternatives to a single occupant vehicle for their transportation needs. At the scale of the Sharp Park specific plan, I think supporting bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, bicycle parking, supporting micromobility and microtransit modes, to Mayor Beer's comments a moment ago, are really where the most impact is likely to be made given the smaller scale of projects. But through that transportation demand management program administered through CCAG, any sort of medium to larger scale projects that trigger 100 average daily trips are going to trigger a requirement to incorporate those transportation demand management principles into their project and there's ongoing monitoring and so forth. In Chapter 8, in Table 8-2, which is on packet page 152, there is an interesting opportunity that the plan would support. It's really not appropriate to get into all of the implementation specifics in the specific plan. But what note number 1 in Table 8-2 says, it's sort of an impactful policy statement sort of hidden, and maybe we can repackage that if desired. It talks about the parking in lieu fee that the City Council has adopted, potentially being recast as a transportation demand management in lieu fee, and really broadening the purpose and utility of the fee. We're singularly focused with the fee on providing off-street parking spaces in a common configuration, but all that does is incentivize and reinforce automobile-oriented transportation. If the desire is to focus on alternatives to single-occupant, automobile trips, using an in lieu fee of some sort to provide other types of transportation infrastructure and incentives could really support those alternatives in a way that the city hasn't previously done. And so that may be something worth revisiting. The plan supports it, right? It has that note, and maybe there's some further amplification of how a policy could support that.
Yeah, I would really appreciate that, my other council members. Commissioner Hauser.
Thank you, Mayor. So this was something that I think was very important to the Planning Commission as well. So on packet page 75, I just wanted to draw your attention to 2 different policies. On packet page 75, 4-I-4, curb management, it talks about creating opportunities for rideshare spaces, Uber and autonomous vehicle spaces, but that's on the public street. So that was something that was thought through, but didn't quite make it into private development. But on policy 4-I-16, which is packet page 86, this is a policy that requires new development to contribute to mobility network options and service quality. And so if you read the note there, it says options include provision of on-site bicycle parking, dedication of space for car share, e-bike charging stations, or electric vehicle charging beyond Cal Green requirements, which currently is just a pre-wire for EV charging. And so I think we felt that this would be a really good vehicle to allow staff to, when looking at a development proposal, or Planning Commission or Council when looking at a development proposal, to require these things.
Mm-hmm. Good. And thank you for mentioning the EV charging, because that was my other thought. And I knew it was in here, but thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, we're done with chapter 4. Moving on to chapter 5. Mayor Pro Tem.
I think I saw an elephant approaching the room. Is this the part where we talk about the height limits again?
We're getting there.
Okay. Throwing it out there.
I can't find it, but I think it was in chapter 5. Two issues or concerns I want to have is we want to, encourage, we want to encourage commercial establishments, restaurants, etc., on Palmetto, excuse me, and Francisco. But Christian, is this the appropriate document for us to actually put in the law or whatever you want to call ordinance that you will put in the venting, etc., or the ability to remodel for venting for restaurants? Because the biggest obstacle for someone to open a restaurant is the capital needed to remodel an old building, and it costs you 150,000 just to do the venting. But when you're building a building, it's a minimal cost. And I would like to see, is it appropriate for this document, or is that something that we cover later?
Councilmember O'Neill, I think that this is an appropriate document if a particular emphasis is on restaurant land uses, for instance, to provide a policy that indicates support for that. We would likely need to include that through some other type of ordinance to provide more specifics and to impose the requirement, including for buildings that maybe don't trigger, a discretionary permit, for instance, under whatever scenario that might occur. And so I think it would be appropriate to include if the will of the council.
Well, I'm just looking to see about flexibility in terms of the buildings being able to be adapted, because I know there was somewhere on here a thing about buildings being built so they can handle a variety of businesses. I think it was in chapter 5, and I'm looking to see if I can find that, but I can't. But I'm just concerned that if you want restaurants there are probably very few buildings there that are adaptable right now to restaurants. And that if we actually want that kind of thing, this is where we put it.
It's on page 100.
100? Thank you, Sue. So is this where we would put it, Christian?
I would need a bit more time to think about the best place in the document to place it. I think it would help to see if there's consensus from the council on that policy. And then we can work on some specific language and placement.
I support that.
That too.
We want us to be flexible. We need this area to be flexible and adaptable.
It depends on the size, because not every, you have a really small commercial. You're not going to want to put in all the elements to put in a restaurant in a little tiny, it might be a coffee shop, it might be a little bookstore, but I think it depends on size.
So is it appropriate to say, for square footage above a certain size?
I think my sense is there are restaurants of a variety of sizes, from very small to very large, and it's hard to say that you will only get a restaurant above a certain square footage. I think to the point about size, it may be a proportionality question. Is the cost too great to include those relative to a very small commercial area? My response to that would be that when we come through with zoning amendments to implement the general plan and the Sharp Park specific plan, we will be talking about minimum commercial FARs. And you're likely to, in my opinion anyways, ensure sufficient floor area for these commercial and mixed use properties that would be able to support that type of mandatory improvement.
The reason this is kind of something first and foremost to me is all we need to do is look at Rockaway Beach. You have the Holiday Inn Hotel there. They did an addition. They have a commercial space downstairs that is not, you see a hotel, you think people got to eat breakfasts, right? But they did not outfit that space, and it has been vacant for probably almost a year at this point. And I had talked to somebody that had a tenant. It was a restaurant, and they were going to have to spend $150,000 to remodel it to get the venting and gas and bathrooms and stuff like that in there. And it just seems frustrating that in our quote visitor serving area such as Rockaway, ground floor at the bottom of a restaurant at a prime corner, we as a city did not encourage this to be a restaurant. So what are we going to end up with? Another real estate office, an insurance company, or something that brings in no revenue to the city, is not visitor serving, and is a waste of valuable commercial space that brings in no revenue in Pacifica. And if you want a whole street of it, let's not make Palmetto adoptable. I've said my piece. Well, I have another piece I'm going to get on soapbox, but.
Well, we want it to be adaptable.
Yeah, and I don't know how to. I don't know how to do it, but I just think in both Palmetto and Francisco, we do it both. Because restaurants do better if there's more than one restaurant. If you have 5 or 6, people do better.
Councilmember O'Neill, I think I'm envisioning preparing the policy, if the council's supportive of it, to apply to all commercial and mixed-use buildings in the specific plan area, so that there's, I think, broad applicability unless the council felt it was appropriate to more narrowly target it to a specific street or streets.
No, I think that's great.
I agree. To have it apply to all of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Next soapbox, okay, is we all know what Manor Shopping Center is, right? And one of the issues at Manor Shopping Center is every single one of those buildings is owned by a different owner. So we tried to have a master sign ordinance, which is like kind of falling apart. If you go down to Solvang, they all look like they're from Denmark. If you go down to, different places, they have a theme. Do we want to have some sort of sign design, and I don't know if I'm using the right term, but sign standards so that this doesn't look tacky or it's a free-for-all, or what do we want? Because you got to remember that if you're building mixed use, do you want this neon light for the apartment on the building for the apartments above it? Okay.
No, I appreciate you bringing that up, Mike, because I was also going to mention the fluorescent signs, and I didn't see anything about that. There is sign design and a lot of information about signage, but I didn't see anything about the fluorescent signs. And I know there's been people complaining about the one. There's one on the little new store on Palmetto.
So I will offer to the council that the Rockaway Beach specific plan includes some basic sign criteria to help achieve a general consistency. I wouldn't say uniformity, but there are guidelines. It is appropriate, I think, to support hopefully a policy that calls for development of either street-wide or specific plan area-wide sign criteria, perhaps as part of the zoning ordinance. It would be difficult, I think, at this stage to maybe go back and do that detailed design work now, but a policy to support consistent theme for corridors might be appropriate. Our current zoning requires multi-unit properties to have master sign programs, but frankly, it's relatively burdensome for individual small property owners to develop that. It's a pain point for me and my team as we work through those requirements, frankly. And so, if we can achieve something that's suitable from a neighborhood-wide standpoint, I think that would be business-friendly, staff-friendly, and maybe result in a better outcome as well, rather than a building-by-building approach. The only counterpoint I'll offer is Eureka Square has a very recently adopted master sign program, for instance, and so maybe Palmetto has one, Francisco may have another, and sort of maybe that's the right balance to consider given the unique characteristics of each of those and the signage needs of those areas.
I'm not saying Palmetto and Francisco have to have the same, but I mean, Sue Vatterlaus was telling me about a merchant that they were going to put up a sign and it was going to cost them $20,000 or something. I don't think we need to put that burden on somebody, but I just don't want a bunch of whole little tacky neon signs up and down Palmetto.
Well, Councilmember O'Neill, I will say in my professional judgment, signage is critically important and often overlooked. It can really make or break the quality and the character of an area. High quality signs can be very expensive, unfortunately, but they're a one-time investment that can last for many years, if not decades, and really, again, make or break an area. Our code wouldn't prescribe a cost, but the higher quality of the sign, I would think it's a reasonable assumption it will be more expensive. And those ticky-tacky signs that you're describing tend to be less expensive and often preferred by business owners on account of the cost. So that's really a policy question for the city council as it relates to the overall outcome and appearance of the area.
It is referenced, very broadly on packet page 90 under guiding policies 5-G-1, a unified image, and it is mentioned signage. And then a few places in lighting and illumination, the zone and that kind of thing.
I took that to be a wayfinding more than regards commercial use. That's just the way I read it. Correct me if I'm wrong, planning director.
I will need to circle around to that policy. I do want to also mention on packet page 92, with respect to the glare question, there is policy 5I10 that talks about light pollution reduction.
Yeah.
And so, excessively bright neon signs, for example, I think would likely be inconsistent with that. And we would want to take the allowable type of lighting, for instance, into consideration when crafting signage guidelines.
So those are my soapboxes for right now.
All right. You ready to talk about height, building height? That's the next one, unless there's something in between. Okay. Okay, so I think you know where I stand. But I really think it's important for us to leave it at 45 feet. Ideally, that extra 10 feet is causing our community, it's causing them pain, like it's making them afraid. Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to agree with you. I think that if I remember a couple of years back, I think we were angling for 35, and 45 itself was kind of a painful conclusion to come to. So while I'm acutely aware of our affordable housing issues, and I mean acutely aware to the tune of the 2 roommates I live with currently, and while I'm acutely aware of the regional housing need allocation numbers that are going to be a tension point for at least the next few months to come up with, it is important to our community, and I will err on the side of Mayor Beer's judgment in this instance.
Others?
The current height limit is 35. So if we're going to expand at all and try to put forward that this city is willing to try to meet our numbers, how are we going to do it? We're going to have to change density. I think that by stepping back the properties and putting rooftop decks makes a huge difference. And I do think that those buildings that look like they're old but aren't, I think buildings can be built that way. For instance, the one that's the Royal Bee, they have a facade. They could have a deck and stepped back residential on the top of that building. And it's not going to affect other people. that's why my big thing with Eureka Square, because it doesn't affect anybody. And I understand the incentive of trying to give people incentive to build more affordable, because that's going to be an issue too, of trying to get more affordable. But if we leave it at the same height limit it is now, what have we accomplished? We're really trying to get somewhere where we can get to our arena numbers. Plus, if you have housing where the commercial is, and this was our downtown, it's supposed to be our downtown. And if you have residential with the commercial, it's a natural incentive for people to walk, to get out, to not use their cars and walk to their shops, walk to the restaurants, and use the shops that are there, so that then those businesses are doing better and better because they have people around them all the time. It's really important. If you don't want people who are going to work and then go home, like downtown San Francisco, where everybody goes there during the day and then they all leave. But if people are living in the same neighborhood and on top of the businesses, then they're going to use those businesses more.
And Sue, thank you for saying that. And then I would just want to clarify for myself that we're talking about the north of San Jose Avenue to 45 feet, and then Palmetto Avenue south of San Jose Avenue is 55. So we are increasing density. Just that one area, I think, is what I'm talking about specifically. Director Murdoch.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. That was the point I wanted to clarify, so that I was understanding the conversation in the right context and I could provide hopefully helpful support. And so if we're focused on a discussion of whether 45 or up to 55 with certain incentives is appropriate on Palmetto Avenue north of San Jose, I think, earlier we talked about some of those relevant considerations. Is that additional height, worth the trade-off for potentially creating, 2 affordable housing units, for instance, on a property? That's a policy tension, again, that the council will have to work through. The Planning Commission prepared a thoughtful policy option for the council. Certainly the council could scale that back, in line with their previous guidance on the specific plan north of San Jose Avenue.
It would be helpful for me to go back to what Mr. Bhatia was saying about the densities and affordable housing development and limiting too much could stimulate builders to invoke state. Please say it. I'm not.
So this is the discussion that Commissioner Hauser can also chime in. We had with the Planning Commission. Currently, so what Commissioner Hauser stated, and Allison can correct me if I'm wrong, that the densities do go up to 50 units per acre, but those densities are not realizable really at 35 or even maybe some instances at 45 feet, so to say. So the question then becomes, if an affordable housing developer does come about, depending on the level of affordability they provide, the state law gives them ability to ask for concessions, anywhere from 1 to 4 concessions. So building height is a typical concession that they ask for. A parking reduction may be another concession they may ask for. And a city is not in a position to say that you take the parking instead of the height concession because we believe that's better for you or more financially feasible. The developer would decide what concession they want. So the question then becomes is that, and that applies, as Christian said, to developments that are more than 6 units in size. So let's say somebody does have an affordable development, they provide the right 10% affordable housing and they ask for that concession, they will get it. Now they can ask for 2 stories, they can ask for 65 feet, for example. There is a path they need to go through to get it. It's not like they'll just get it tomorrow, What Christian was alluding to is that we would provide an alternative path that in case they do not want to go in that direction and spend the months to get that additional height, well, hey, you have the 55 feet, and if you meet it, it's an easier path to getting implemented for larger projects and for smaller projects that do not otherwise would qualify for the state density bonus, that would still be in all level of fairness be available to the small guys as well. And if it's a really small lot and they are still stepping back in the front and the side and the lot is only so big, I mean, the perceptual mass of that building is not going to be that big compared to a bigger lot where, you know, a bigger building may really come in. So it's a balancing act across a variety of criteria. Commissioner Hauser? I don't know if you have something to add. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Mr. Bhatia?
Yeah.
Those density bonuses, do they overrule the Coastal Commission?
So there are the density. So there are the density bonuses, and then there are the development regulation concessions. I'm going to defer to the city attorney about the Coastal Commission issue. Yeah.
Because we have a de facto height limit now of 35 feet because it's in the coastal zone. When we want to go to, if we want to make it 55 or 45, it's a battle either way. But what I'm asking is, are you saying that we limit it to 45, they want to get the density bonus, will that raise it to 55 or 65 or whatever, big, and overrule the Coastal Commission's rules?
Yeah, I mean, I think in effect what you're asking is that the concession they ask for is a height concession, right? I mean,
yeah.
Are we compelled to grant it even though our height limit may be lower as under the coastal plan? I'm not sure to the answer to that. Christian or Michelle may have an answer to that. Yeah.
Sure. I'll start first, and City Attorney Kenyon can add on as necessary. State density bonus law is in Government Code Section 65915, and subdivision M, as in Michael, of that really gets to the core of what we're talking about. And I'll read it. It's not very long. It says this section, which is the state density bonus law, does not supersede or in any way alter or lessen the effect or application of the California Coastal Act of 1976. Any density bonus, concessions, incentives, waivers, or reductions of development standards and parking ratios to which the applicant is entitled under this section shall be permitted in a manner that is consistent with this section and Division 20, commencing with Section 30,000, which is the Coastal Act. So we need to reconcile those two important policy components of state law: density bonus and affordable housing on one hand, coastal resource protection through the Coastal Act and our LCP on the other hand. So as I mentioned earlier, while the state density bonus law can still apply in the coastal zone, the city will be on the defensive, as I mentioned earlier, where we have to justify why the density bonus would be inconsistent with the Coastal Act and our LCP. And it puts us in a position of having to argue why that density bonus incentive or concession should not be granted. I would rather the city be in a place where a developer chooses not to invoke state density bonus law, and we can negotiate what the appropriate outcome is, up to and including 55 feet in height and 50 units per acre in the mixed use center. The trade-off is that they invoke density bonus law and we have much less control to achieve the desired outcomes, and we may get 55 feet or more in height, as those folks may be entitled to under state density bonus law, unless the city can conclude that it's inconsistent with the Coastal Act, for instance.
And Councilmember Neal, prior to 2019, the coastal zone provisions prevailed over the density bonus regulations. So the state law that Christian is referring to for the density bonus about harmonizing that with the coastal zone, in effect, overturned a court case that was out there. That was a guiding one that said that the Coastal Act prevailed. But it still speaks to the notion of harmonizing. What I didn't have the answer to is the concession and the height issue. I don't know that. But on the density issue, I do know that the state law asks us to harmonize the state's affordability density provisions with the provisions of the Coastal Act. Yeah. And it sort of puts the city in this odd situation in needing to harmonize it. And we're just sort of better off to the extent we can have more control over it through an alternative path that gives, the developer some guidance, as Christian suggested. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I just want to be sure I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I could be wrong. The RENA numbers of approximately 1,900 is requiring the city to identify 1,900 places that they can build some sort of housing. And we have no control of whether or not we will actually get it built because a developer has to come in. How many units, if we go down from 55 to 45, we would have to identify X amount of units somewhere else in the city to build the 1,900. Am I understanding that correctly, Christian, or articulating that correct?
Generally, yes, Councilmember O'Neill. Part of our housing sites analysis that we have to go through to demonstrate our ability to accommodate the RHNA is demonstrating that our assumptions are reasonable. We start with the characteristics of the site, including the size, the maximum allowable density, and then how developments have realistically developed in reliance on those. So most aren't developing at 100% of density, for example. And so there are assumptions that need to be baked into those calculations that say realistically the density will be as such. When you take a height from 55 feet to 45 feet or 45 to 35, those reasonable assumptions of the achievable density understandably go down. It's harder to fit more units in a smaller building, for instance, than it is in a taller building. And so there could be impacts where we cannot assume as many units on sites that are limited to 35 or 45 feet that thus have to be made up at some site elsewhere in the city.
Okay, so I just wanted to throw that out into the discussion and part of the recipe for this. So thank you, Christian. Thank you, Rajiv.
Yeah, and that makes me wonder, like, how many units would that be north of San Jose Avenue?
And the answer is not many, Mayor Beer. I think it's more of a illustrative of the city's support, and it would help us make the argument to the state in certifying our housing element that we're taking all reasonable measures to support housing production generally and affordable housing specifically. But at the end of the day, it's not going to make or break our RHNA, in my opinion.
No, I was just going to say, in terms of going to the Coastal Commission, since they're probably not going to be real happy with either 45 or 55, would it be more prudent to go in there with 55, intending that we won't go any lower than 45 from a negotiating point of view?
And forgive me, City Manager Woodhouse, I'll briefly respond to Councilmember O'Neill. Perhaps I think our assessment is that whether it's 45 or 55, the visual resources impacts are not meaningfully different. Okay. You see what you see from public view and vantage points, along the public rights of way in some minimum number of publicly owned property, which really are the key coastal views that we are obligated to protect and preserve. And once you go above 35 feet, which is the current baseline, what's going to change in terms of blue water views or mountain views in this particular neighborhood between 45 and 55? In my opinion, not all that much. There are other considerations like scale and neighborhood character, which are relevant. But in terms of visual resources impacts, I'm not sure there's a meaningful difference in my judgment.
Okay.
And many of the parcels are also corner parcels. We have such small blocks here that when they're stepping the buildings back, they'll have to be stepping it back from 2 streets in the front and not just Palmetto. You've got to remember that. And in many instances, there are only 2 parcels, one on either corner. And so the mass does get reduced, pretty effectively when you step back. Yeah.
City Manager Woodhouse and then Mayor.
Sure. Thank you. Sorry, I know Mayor Pro Tem had his hand up. Something occurred to me in the discussion about the state density bonus laws that I wanted to see if this is an oversimplification or if it's a potentially unintended consequence. And that is that if the current Planning Commission recommendation related to 55 feet height is scaled back to 45, an unintended consequence of that would be to incentivize more potential developers to utilize the state density bonus law and result in loss of control factors, certain factors, loss of control to the city and higher height than 45 anyways. Is that is that an unintended consequence or a simplification of this?
City manager, I think this was, actually specifically discussed. So it's not an unintended consequence. They actually discussed this very issue, the planning commission, that this is what will happen if we were to not do that. And can we just try to get more control and then try to provide that incentive from the city's perspective, as opposed to developers by default wanting to veer off in the direction and then seek the state density bonus. So they talked about it, actually, the commission. And I think two of the commissioners are pretty well versed in those state laws. I mean, amazingly well versed. Yeah. So they knew the depths of it. Yeah.
And briefly, Mayor, whether or not it's likely or unlikely, the fact is that without providing this mechanism as recommended by the Planning Commission, there would be no available alternative for a developer to use other than state density bonus law, which I think by default makes it perhaps more likely to occur in that instance.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I think I developed three more questions since I initially raised my hand.
Hydra.
Right? So starting from the back, Commissioner Hauser, in your opinion, in your experience, because I know you have experience in this realm, are we doing ourselves a favor by retaining more control if we were to go along with the 55 feet?
Yeah, I mean, so, as Mr. Bhatia pointed out, this was something we talked about a lot. It is definitely preferable to not have the state density bonus being what governs a developer. State density bonus takes a sledgehammer to something that really requires a chisel. So in addition to, let's just say I'm a developer and I provide a housing development with 10% of the units being moderate, which is less than the Pacifica Municipal Code currently requires. I automatically qualify for a state density bonus, which allows for one concession. And it could be whatever I want as long as I can prove that there's an economic benefit to me. And then unlimited waivers. And that's the thing that is really scary, is these unlimited waivers. So if there is any sort of development standard that the city, or objective standard that the city has established, a developer using the state density bonus law could say, I don't want to do a setback that's this big. I don't want to do a step back. I don't want to have glazing on the bottom. I don't want to have commercial. They could go through the whole gamut and get to something that looks completely different than anything that was ever intended by this plan. So the idea by using an incentive that is a Pacifica incentive is to hold the purse strings and to hold that control so that we do have the flexibility to do something that's aesthetically pleasing and respectful of the neighborhood and the community and the local, like our own ethos as Pacificans.
So I think you answered my next question in answering the last one, but I'm going to ask it again so I can hear it again with that specific question in mind. And the question is, if a developer were to apply for these height concessions, then I think what I just heard you say is they're at that point no longer, even though they're asking for the height concession, they're simultaneously no longer constrained by our design standards.
That is correct. As long as it is an objective design standard, then they are not constrained by them. And it's the way it's qualified, I believe, is that it's anything.
Wait, say that last part again. Objective design standards.
Yes, they could waive out of any of our objective design standards. Any guideline, any design standard, any municipal code requirement for a setback or open space or parking. I mean, and in addition to the concession and the waivers that are unlimited, there's subdivision P of the state density bonus law, which already has a parking reduction baked into it. So I can't state enough that we really tried to do things in a way where developers would not be able to concede out of the commercial that we were thinking of, or provide minimal affordable housing and get all of these incentives that probably were not meant for them, but were meant for true, low and very low affordable housing deed restricted units.
I'm coming back to the conversation, but I see City Attorney just came on.
Well, not to correct any of the information and actually legal analysis that you've gotten from your staff and Planning Commissioner Hauser, who've done an excellent job. I'm just here to provide, I will say, color, because I can tell you that this struggle that you all are having right now with how do you deal with the implications of the state density bonus law and what it means in practically when an application comes in, as Ms. Hauser just so eloquently articulated for you. That is a discussion that councils are having everywhere because of what is happening with the RENA numbers and the need to find those units and this balance between being specific in what you want versus sort of anticipating what is going to come to you and how can you address that future development that you don't have in front of you. And so it is a balancing test. And I think what you're hearing from your liaison on the Planning Commission is that the Planning Commission has spent hours on this and many meetings discussing this and coming up with an approach that is not unusual, or that is an approach that other communities have followed as well when dealing with this tough issue that you're all dealing with. So, thank you.
Thank you. And I have spent hours and hours watching the Planning Commission deliberate on this, and hours deliberating on this specific topic, and none the least of which Vice Chair Hauser speaking in such a way to bring us to this policy that it seemed through my hours of observation, she was, along with the rest of the Planning Commission, doing everything they could to protect us to the point where we could decide our own destiny more likely through this methodology than the alternative. So for me, it's painful for me to vote against one unit of affordable housing. I just want to throw that out there. That's where I'm oriented from. That's where I'm coming from. But I was simultaneously, it's painful for me to vote against the community wanting their community to be the scale and the consistency that they want it. And I even 45 feet was kind of going to a place that was uncomfortable for me, north of San Jose, and I'm only talking about north of San Jose, on Palmetto, on Palmetto. And just talking about that, 45 feet was kind of uncomfortable for me within that context of the community. And what I kind of wanted to say was, well, we don't have control over what the state says we have to do. We do have control over saying that we support the community and what they'd like to see. And from there, if the state wants to come in and impose, well, we have the design standards in place, and then it's incumbent on the state to deal with it. And I would be charmed if that oversimplification actually was something that I heard any evidence was true based on everything I've just heard, which again makes for a really uncomfortable position for me to be in, because I'd really like to, even though it hurts to give up any units of affordable housing, but hearing my planning director tell me, it's not really that much affordable housing. Okay, I can swallow that then for the sake of my community. What's hard for me is hearing that if I don't do this thing, which my community is looking at, saying, are you nuts? That is not what we want here. But simultaneously hearing that may be the exact same mechanism by which we can retain any control whatsoever. That's painful. And that's what I get to consider now as I listen to my contemporaries, and I'm in a place where I don't know how I'm going to fall, but that's where I'm at right now. Thank you.
So,
go ahead, Mike.
Christian, Samantha, or anybody else on the deck, is just reverse engineering or turn it around, keeping a 45-foot height limit, is there some sort of incentive we could give a developer for keeping it at 45 that would not make them want to go for the density bonus? I don't know if I'm making myself clear or not. Because they want to go for a bonus to go higher. Is there some bonus that you can think of off the top, and I realize this is brand new to you, okay? To go to keep it at 45, to disincentivize them to go higher.
It's hard for me to imagine. I think we need to see if there are any direct, economic, financial components to that. I think the in lieu parking fee is one area to explore, a waiver of that in certain instances. But relative to the cost of, or I guess the potential income, I should say, of an additional unit, it's a relatively small amount, even if the council were to waive the in lieu parking fee. Beyond that, I'm at a loss right now to think of additional ways to incentivize affordable housing production.
Mr. Bhatia and then Commissioner Hauser.
I was going to just say that whatever, parking is the first thing that came to my mind. And then, because that's the biggest cost is structured parking.
Commissioner Hauser.
Yeah, I mean, the easy one for me is ground floor commercial space. Commercial space is either a loss leader or a net neutral to most developers. And if you could use it for housing and getting more housing, then that is an obvious way to create an economic benefit. Again, that's something via a state density bonus that could already happen. Someone could concede out of the commercial or waiver out of the commercial even. I think the question is, how do you balance that? And I think Mr. Murdoch, I would expect you to weigh in on this. Is how do you balance that against all of these other policies where we've really tried to put forth an active ground floor that's walkable and pedestrian friendly with strong street walls? So that's the low-hanging fruit I see, but I don't know if that undoes other things that we really care about.
Sure. If I may, Madam Mayor, I would continue on with what Commissioner Hauser said and maybe put in context the existing challenges that exist for creation of a vibrant, dynamic Palmetto Avenue. We are not in a situation like many other downtowns where there are multiple streets and there's this nice grid configuration with multiple opportunities and wraparound commercial in a very continuous environment. We're talking primarily on Palmetto about a long, linear mixed use area that we're trying to create that has enough critical mass of interesting uses and businesses and so forth that we do draw the types of investment and visitors and so forth that we're seeking with the plan to basically result in half of that available area by foregoing ground floor commercial use north of San Jose Avenue as a trade-off to manage height while also achieving affordable housing. You might really drastically undercut the primary mission of the plan, which is to create a vibrant mixed-use commercial destination.
City Manager Woodhouse.
Again, I'm going to say something that I don't know if it's going to help the council or not, but it occurs to me to realize that the decision that you make on this matter tonight is not necessarily a permanent decision for the next 20 years for Pacifica, that plans and policies can be revised in the future and revisions to the plan. And Mr. Murdoch or Ms. Kennan, please chime in on that. But, there are so many variables related to development incentives and what's happening in Pacifica and what might happen in Pacifica that, we would learn from what does happen and then adjust. So whether that helps or not, just a reminder that the decision about this is very important, but not permanent for future decades, right?
Would it be possible, this is kind of spot zoning, that only the larger parcels can have a height limit of 55 and the rest remain at 45? Because there's some larger parcels there. Or if some developer buys, 4 or 5 parcels to build something.
It's certainly possible, Councilmember O'Neill. I think what that incentivizes is lot consolidation potentially, which is one of the goals of this plan to achieve better building design and site planning. And then once you have that larger lot, even at the minimal densities, you have a project that is going to trigger state density bonus law and achieve 8 or more units, which is going to be subject to the city's below market rate inclusionary ordinance and wouldn't be in this category of project, frankly. And so we're really talking about projects that are, I would say, 7 units and below, 6 and 7 unit projects, which is in that sweet spot for the lot sizes that we're talking about in this area.
Okay, council, where do we go from here?
I mean, I think we just take a sense of the council to see how many are 55, how many are 45. And looking at faces, I don't know if anybody's made up their mind.
After hearing every single thing, I just want to stand up for the community and say north of Number Street, what it was now.
San Jose.
Yeah, thank you. I'm getting frustrated over here in my little house. Yeah, I still think north of San Jose needs to be 45, not 55. So that's where I stand. And how about the rest of you?
Well, I'm leaning towards the 45 and we just kind of risk it because, you know.
Council member Wallace, I think you already said yours. Can't unmute. There you go.
There I go. Sorry.
No.
I had Mike's problem. The cursor was somewhere else. I think this is all hard because we are changing the neighborhood. It's been in process for, I don't even know how long to make this a downtown. And it's difficult. Okay. You know, people want things here to stay the same. And in order to go forward and get what the state wants, and it's hard. It's hard. It could come out just beautiful, and it's hard to imagine it. The pictures, you know, are it's difficult to even follow what the pictures are. And I get that, but I think that, you know, I think we have to do something.
All right, Councilmember Beckmeyer, Mayor Pro Tem.
I think 45 and 55. I think 45 north of San Jose and 55 elsewhere. I think that the risk of the invocation of a density bonus is a calculated risk. And as I'm looking at the figures 3-2 on existing land use, what happened to 3-3? There it is.
What page are you on?
Packet page 36. 36 and 41. And we received public comment on this issue as well. I think what I want to test is my understanding of if it were 45, there is the risk that a developer could say, no, I want a density bonus, and not have to abide by any of the other design considerations basically in that transaction. What was concerning me a minute ago was I was hearing they could even ask for 65. And I went, what? So, you know, I think the rubber part for me is what is the risk of what they're going to do and not knowing, not being able to control it. But considering the coastal zone that we are in and the need to respect the view shed area and the neighborhood character that we do see consistently brought up by the Coastal Commission, I think those are going to be issues for us and for any projects that come forward. And if we're attempting to have our guidelines as much as possible blend in with the neighborhood while changing it, I feel like 45 is a good compromise.
You know, I heard a member of our community who's extraordinarily active and who has been a member of this area specifically for a long time tell us all, and she's a member of our commissions, that this to her is a nightmare. And I think that 45 feet in and of itself probably isn't making that nightmare any better, even though I think that it sounds like consensus is leaning toward that being the least we can do to make it not quite as much of a nightmare. So I want to at least acknowledge that. She can't be the only one who's feeling that way. I also appreciate other community members feel different, etc. But, you know, if somebody's telling me that I might be about to, you know, I'm not going to keep beating the dead horse. So within that context, that this, you know, maybe minimizing it a little bit, I will vote with consensus and take the chance that maybe we're not losing the last little bit of control we could have had. And at least we're trying on any level to stand up for our community, however it winds up being received. 45 north of San Jose.
Okay.
With no incentives if they build affordable, even on small projects. Because that was one of their items that, you know, with possibly going up to 55 if you have the incentives, building sort of like Eureka Square to build affordable even on small projects.
Not north of San Jose.
Madam Mayor, depending where the majority of the council goes on this, I think one policy option to minimize the risk of projects invoking state density bonus law is to lower the density that's allowable for those areas north of San Jose Avenue. The Planning Commission had recommended as part of policy 3I39 that to maintain compatible scale, density be allowed at 30 to 35 dwelling units per acre. Limiting it to 30 units, for instance, would, I think, reduce the number of lot sizes that potentially could achieve 6 units and thus trigger state density bonus law. That's one risk mitigation approach the council could consider as a companion to limiting building heights to 45 feet north of San Jose Avenue. The flip side of that is it would limit the number of potential projects that might get to 8 units and trigger the city's BMR ordinance and again have adverse effects on affordable housing production. But it sounds like the council may be leaning towards balancing this issue in favor of neighborhood scale and more modest height limits. And so as a supplement to that, you may push down the density to 30 units per acre, for instance.
Council?
That makes sense to me.
Makes sense to me.
Specifically north of San Jose, only along Palmetto.
Correct.
Yeah.
All right, then I think.
And one of the biggest vacant lots that is in Sharp Park is on Palmetto between Salada and Santa Maria, which is north of San Jose.
It's harder and harder. Every single sentence makes it harder and harder. Well, I'm staying with what I said. So does anyone else want to?
So basically, we're given a consensus of 55 below south of San Jose, 45 above, only on Palmetto. I'm okay with that.
And
Madam Mayor,
yes.
To Councilmember Battalos's point, I think the lots described at the southwest corner of Santa Maria and Palmetto Avenue, it's designated mixed-use center currently. Even pushing the density down to 30 units per acre, that project would trigger 11 units and it would be eligible for state density bonus law. So it would be able to provide affordable housing and benefit from those variety of concessions and waivers. And the council would have limited options to prevent that.
So regardless, so it doesn't make any difference.
Right, unless a fundamental change in density much lower than 30 units was considered.
Okay.
Which we would not recommend at this point.
Okay.
So are we lowering the density to 30?
Yes.
Okay.
Right? With folks, okay. Okay, let's move on to chapter.
While we're on this page, I
Yeah,
know that I brought it up and one of the members of the public brought it up. And I know you explained it, Christian, but could you explain again to me why certain parcels are designated certain ways? We did go through this with a property, I believe on Salada, where they ended up parking their cars on the front yard because that's how the zoning, it was a R1, it was zoned R2 and it had to be R3. And it was a really, even though it wasn't 3 units, it was a very complicated process. And if some of these lots are already designated incorrectly, and what about lots that are in process of approval right now? What happens with those?
Sure. So Councilmember Battalos, you're referring to the Lot 37 Salada Avenue project, which has now been constructed. It was a very difficult process. I'll admit that the city didn't have, the best tools available at that time. And the tools that were available were to redesignate that property to high density residential, which I think elicited some reactions from the council at that time. It didn't feel like the right approach. But due to just the mathematics of how the density ranges are calculated, the applicable zoning that corresponds and allows development at those densities, and the very small lot size that generated a high quote unquote density, even for one single family residence, that was, I stand behind the right approach to resolve that issue from the tools that were in the toolbox at the time. The other, I think, considerations that made that project difficult were that the lots, as I mentioned, small, but very narrow as well. The options to provide a nice, economically desirable house while also providing a driveway and a garage, it was hard to imagine how all of that could be provided. There are ways to do it, but there are trade-offs in building design, and we provided examples of that and so on. At the end of the day, the council said, hey, we don't want to do this again. So where I'm hoping to address that is through zoning revisions that implement small lot size development standards, which may allow development of lots, for instance, to be constructed without changing the general plan under certain strict development standards, perhaps much smaller floor areas and finding a way to accommodate parking in a way that's acceptable to the neighborhood. But the reality is there's just no good way to make everybody happy when you have such small lots, which is one of the factors in favor of encouraging lot consolidation by making development of individual very small lots undesirable and consolidation and development of larger lots that provide design flexibility more desirable. That's the challenge for me that I have to try to put something together for the council to consider as part of the zoning ordinance update. At this point, we really, again, tried to stick very close to direction not to tinker with the east-west streets in this Short Park specific plan and to really focus on the north-south commercial and mixed-use corridors. And that's why, for better or for worse, we haven't proposed a bunch of land use changes to maybe right size some of those densities or to reflect existing built conditions. We kept status quo from 1980 local coastal land use plan, and it would require direction from the council to go back and revisit that at this time.
Okay, and the properties, so since you didn't change anything, the properties that are in process are still the same as they were before.
That's right. And I'm not familiar with the application that one of the public commenters referenced earlier. You know, if that came in late in the day today, I'm not aware of it. But again, I think the more relevant point is whatever the council may do tonight or in an upcoming meeting, this plan and the local coastal land use plan are not going to be certified in a day or a week or even a month by the Coastal Commission. And so again, another instance of where status quo remains, and we will have to use the tools in the toolbox today, including those tools that we had to use for Salata Avenue, Lot 37, that may come back again. And we just have to maybe figure out if there's a incrementally better way to design a project on one of those sites.
Thank you for re-clarifying that with me.
Okay, should we move on to chapter 6? Mayor Pro Tem.
Short answer, yes. But before we do, I just wanted to say, after watching the Planning Commission going through all of this, especially chapters 3, 4, and 5, and we just got the smallest taste of that. And I just want to reiterate how grateful I am for the pains that the Planning Commission has taken to get us to this point. That may be the most difficulty we have all night. So thank you again, Planning Commission.
Thank you for saying that. I was thinking the same thing. Okay, anything in chapter 6? Mayor Pro Tem.
Just a question on page, well, it's 6-9. And I don't think I could tell you the packet page off the top of my head. Let's see. It is packet page 120. And it's the last thing basically on the page under electricity and natural gas, and especially at the top of that paragraph. I was just wondering if the relationship between Peninsula Clean Energy and PG&E I was wondering how accurate that narrative is. And I think I probably speak from a bias working mostly with PCE that's just my orientation. So this may be very accurate, but I wanted to bring focus to that for just a moment and ask.
Mayor Pro Tem, I'm not seeing any factual inaccuracies with the narrative as it's presented, but perhaps if there's something more specific you'd like to be clarified, we could revisit that narrative and maybe make a more explicit statement that they are separate utility providers, or PCE provides electricity through PG&E's distribution system, but sources it through its own power contracts. I just would need to understand more about what clarification or distinction should be made.
It's something akin to an ego trip where, I want PCE to get as much credit as possible, but at the end of the day, you're right. I don't think it's inaccurate, and I just wanted to have that conversation out loud in a very public venue to make sure that's straight for me. Thank you.
Well, is it inaccurate to say PCE and Pacific Gas and Electric currently provide gas and electric services to Pacifica homes? Oh no, PCE doesn't provide gas. Because they're not mentioned until a little ways down that paragraph.
Right. It was like I was thinking to myself they should be leading with PCE, but I mean, even when it comes to at electric services, well, the poles and the wires are all PG&E. So it's not an inaccurate statement. I just, as I was reading it, I felt a momentary wounding of pride because I've been so closely identifying with PCE lately. So again, as I'm speaking it out loud, I'm hearing it more clearly to my satisfaction.
Okay.
City Manager Woodhouse.
Well, I was going to offer that we could under the council's direction, we don't have to wordsmith that language tonight, but we could certainly augment it, clean it up a little bit, make PCE more prominent, describe the relationship between PCE and PG&E. If we get just direction from the council that's what you want us to do for the final document.
I would favor that.
Me too.
Okay. Great.
Hey. Nothing else in chapter 6, going to chapter 7.
Kind of on the same line, in the solid waste paragraph, we're leading with landfills.
On page, where are you?
121.
Oh, okay.
And while landfills are a thing, Senate Bill 1383 and other regulations that are currently in place that may not have been when this was originally put together, maybe not as strongly. I just wonder if we could, it does say Recology emphasizes waste reduction and diversion. I'd like to see that up higher. Because the emphasis on landfills at the beginning of that sentence, listing the things they provide, is troublesome. Because I don't think most of Pacifica's waste are going to landfills, based on what I've heard from Chris Porter. We are super green waste, producer, if you will, and have been for quite a time. So I think it's along the same line. I would want to see that maybe emphasized.
City Manager, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I think we could do that same thing. I know that comma list there mentions transfer stations and materials recovery facilities, and we could move what are affectionately known as MRFs in the industry, materials recovery facilities, before landfills and transfer stations, and emphasize recycling and composting collection more in that paragraph.
That would be great.
Mm-hmm.
While we're in that section, and I did send a list of typos to staff, which I think this was included in that list, but it says residential recyclable waste is collected every other week, and it occurs to me residential recyclable waste is collected every week.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 7. Mayor Pro Tem.
Packet page 136, figure 7-8. And it was a curiosity of what the one stationary source exceeding Bay Area Air Quality Management District threshold was. Is that Clay Creations?
It is not. This figure is from a statewide data source using latitude and longitude that I think erroneously plots this dot, and we need to fix it. It is a generator at the old wastewater treatment plant facility along Montecito Avenue. And so we will adjust that dot to correctly reflect the location.
That's what I thought it was from the narrative. And then, okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Mayor Pro Tem.
Because so whenever I read a narrative about the seawall north of the pier, I always start screaming in my head, it's a retaining wall, not a seawall. But that harkens back to the earlier conversation about the community really wanting us to emphasize our commitment to preserving that area of town. And I just want to remind at this point that the conversation we had earlier is that we actually might be murking the waters more if we try to emphasize it in this document. And that is why we are not doing so, to the best of my understanding right now, unless, of course, anyone disagrees.
Well, I'm concerned about acknowledging the need that was raised by some who live in that community, and the confidence. I think there's an element of confidence and trust that the community, that the city is going to take care of the community, of property owners, of homeowners, of people. And if there's a way to impart that without triggering the concerns raised by staff, I would like to see us do that. I just don't know where to do it. I don't think creating a policy is probably the best thing to do, but it is simply a fact that we've submitted this in our local land use plan update, our local coastal land use update. So
we also have the Beach Boulevard Infrastructure Resiliency Project too, right?
Right. Excuse me. So shoreline, I'm looking at packet page 142.
If I could offer, in the meantime, just a slightly different perspective or restatement of what Mr. Murdoch said earlier. And this reminds me of other city business, administrative and policy issues, be it labor MOUs or policies and city ordinances, where for administrative efficiency and not to inadvertently create additional administrative approvals or regulatory approvals, we try not to overlap too much stuff, because the council direction and the council position and policies related to the Bieber project are clear. And and the policies in the LCLUP that the council approved. And so just admit, there can be inadvertent consequences of creating hoops to jump through if you intertwine certain things in multiple plans, right? I don't know if that helps at all, but that's sort of part of the driver here.
That helps me, Councilmember Beckmeyer. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, as I look at the paragraph on page 142 that describes the project, the resiliency project, it is very clear what is contemplated in that project and what it's aiming to do. So in terms of, I just am wondering if there's somewhere else in this section, in the introduction to this section, that you can have a more general statement.
Councilmember Wallace, were you going to say something?
Go ahead.
No, I saw it in there too. I mean, it pretty well explains what's going to happen in that process.
You're talking about on page 142, Sue?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
In several of those areas on page 142.
Yeah.
It says to protect public infrastructure, recreational homes, businesses, and the community at large from impacts due to continued coastal erosion. I think that statement right there is is what was asked for.
I'm also seeing on page 124, in the very place that I was suggesting that we consider, this chapter establishes goals and policies that, in combination with the general plan and local coastal program policies and other local, state, and federal regulations, mitigate the potential negative effects of natural and man-made environmental hazards and coastal resiliency issues. What do you think? Covers it?
I mean, I think it covers it more on page 142.
Yeah.
So I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Okay. Chapter 8. Mayor Pro Tem.
It is my last note that I have put for the evening. So there's a couple different paragraphs here. One is about updating the parkland in lieu fees. What's my, hold on. There's a couple different things here about impact fees, and what occurred to me as I was reading it was it's talking about those impact fees as though we're going to have the conversation, and what occurred to me is that we've already had the conversation. And so I was wondering if it wouldn't be appropriate here to merely change it to the past tense rather than the future tense.
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem. Just given the drafting date of this language relative to when the council this year updated those fees, we do need to update the narrative, and we'll do that.
Thank you. That's all I got.
Okay. Anybody else? Do we have a motion? Mayor Pro Tem?
I'm not ready to make a motion. I wanted to make sure staff presented these changes to, I think, 3-11, 3-20, and 5-9 on the recommendation of Planning Commission early. I think we all gave consensus that we're including those in the motion. I just wanted to remind us all of that before a motion's made.
And Mayor, I wanted to make sure, and Mr. Murdoch may be ready with policy language. There are a couple suggested additions or policy revisions that we want to make sure to show that we've captured. And Christian, are you going to show language or just read language, or?
I would need a bit more time to repackage it in a visual manner. Maybe I can start by reading, and if we need to wordsmith, we can do that.
That's all right.
So if it's all right, Madam Mayor, I'd like to just run down the list of the City Council's directed revisions, and then some of those involve more extensive policy language. We can pause there and take it as the council needs. The council did move around the document, not entirely consecutively, and so we may be jumping around from chapter to chapter. I apologize in advance for that. The first on the list I have is adding a policy to Chapter 4 to install extra signage and other engineering measures to reduce wrong way travel on one-way streets. Add a table of contents. Amend the bicycle and pedestrian master plan to incorporate the additional improvements recommended by the Planning Commission. Policy 3G4, revise that to also allow expansions of size and range of services provided by the Pacifica Resource Center, consistent with the development standards for the underlying land use designation. One where I have a question mark for confirmation by the council is ensuring that there is a description, perhaps at the first reference in the narrative, to the Pacifica Pier, indicating that its formal name is the Reverend Herschel Hawkins Pier. What's less clear is if the council wanted all references to the Pacifica Pier to be to the Reverend Herschel Hawkins Pier, which would require a number of figure updates, or if a mention in the narrative is sufficient.
I'm okay with just Pacifica Fair. I mean, that's what's the common vernacular.
As long as
it's fine.
As long as it's named there once somewhere.
Yeah, page 21, I looked it up for you.
Yeah, I thought I saw it on page 18, but yes. Yes, somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll make sure that that first mention of the pier in the narrative is inclusive of Reverend Herschel Hawkins Pier. Next item, table 8-2 in note number 1, wanting a policy to amplify that the city council is interested at some point in, as the term is used, recasting the parking in lieu fee to a transportation demand management in lieu fee. So the policy that we would add would be explore opportunities to replace or supplement the parking in lieu fee with a transportation demand management fee to support transportation modes other than personal automobiles.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next item, add a policy to require the inclusion of venting and other improvements necessary for restaurants at the time of building construction. And that policy language would be ensure that commercial and mixed-use buildings are designed and constructed to include venting and other required mechanical improvements to allow restaurant uses.
I don't know if it has to include the venting, but allow the easy installation of the venting. Because, I mean, you go in there, you don't know where the stove is going to be, right? You know, so that it would be fairly easy to install, not get into structural modifications.
Mayor Pro Tem, I saw your face.
Just clarification, planning director, does that mean that we'll be presumably discussing an ordinance associated with that policy when it comes to goal settings time?
It's possible. I think we'll need to further assess the best way to effectuate that. You know, I mentioned earlier that there may be instances where a project does not need discretionary review. I think nearly all projects subject to this policy will, and we can, you know, insert that in the planning commission level review, for instance. And so an ordinance may end up ultimately not being necessary, but we would need to consider if that should be a supplement to this. So based on Councilmember O'Neill's feedback, I would suggest a revision then to ensure that commercial and mixed-use buildings are designed and constructed to allow ready installation of venting and other required mechanical improvements to allow restaurant uses. I would like to consult with the building official, you know, should the council make a motion to approve tonight to see if there's more specific technical wording. There may be like a chase or other sort of technical term that we can use to be much more specific, but within the intent of the council.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Another policy that could be added is to develop signage guidelines for distinct commercial and mixed-use corridors to ensure consistency in sign design. All right, next item on packet page 57, policy 3-I-39. Revise that policy to maintain a compatible scale. Development along Northern Palmetto Avenue, north of San Jose Avenue, shall be allowed at a density of 30 dwelling units per acre and at heights up to 45 feet. And then we would delete the italicized text in policy 3I-11, which makes a reference to the affordable housing policies in the revised 3I-39. And there may be a need to make some corresponding edits to certain tables describing land use densities, and we would just want that direction as well. Moving on, page 6-9, which is packet page 120. We're going to rework the electricity and gas narrative to make Peninsula Clean Energy more prominent and to more clearly describe what PCE is and its purpose and relevance in Pacifica. Page 6-10, similarly with the solid waste section, as City Manager Woodhouse described, we'll reorder the list of Recology services to emphasize its recycling, waste reduction, and diversion services, including composting, to de-emphasize the landfill services. Page 6-10, correct the misstatement by indicating that residential recyclable waste is collected every week as opposed to every other week. Figure 7-8, correct the misplaced stationary source that exceeds backbone thresholds to its correct location on Montecito Avenue at the old wastewater treatment plant. Page 8-6, revised language regarding the park in lieu fee adoption to indicate that it has been adopted, not that it needs to be or should be adopted and updated. And then lastly, as mentioned by Mayor Pro Tem, the additional revisions presented in the slides to fully incorporate the Planning Commission's recommendations.
And Christian, did you include the building height decision in your list?
Yes, that was the mention of policy 3I39 related to Palmetto Avenue north of San Jose Avenue.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Director Murdoch, for all that on the spot work that you just did. Appreciate you. Okay. Do we have a motion? Are we ready to make a motion?
Are we ready for a motion?
Yes.
Okay. I have it here. Move to adopt the attached resolution to A, find approval of the Sharp Park specific plan to be substantially consistent with the plan evaluated in the general plan update and Sharp Park specific plan final environmental impact report, state clearinghouse number 20120220046, certified by the City Council on July 11th, 2022, for purposes of complying with California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, and approve the Sharp Park specific plan as recommended by the Planning Commission as amended, and incorporate all maps and testimony into the record by reference.
I'll second. But and with the indications that Christian gave us.
I said amended, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Before we vote, I just want, this has been a 3-year-long process at least. Allison Moore and Rajiv Bhatia and any of the other crew at Diet and Bhatia, thank you so much. Thank you, Planning Commission. Again, it's been remarkable watching the Herculean effort that you have put into doing everything you can to address every nuance you can. And staff, you never get enough credit for the work that you do. And so thank you for the work that you do for us to keep our city running as smoothly as possible within the context of the direction we're trying to give you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Exactly.
Echo that.
Echo that.
100%.
And with the motion by Councilmember O'Neill and seconded by Councilmember Vaterlos for the proposed action as amended, I'll start the roll call vote with Councilmember Beckmeyer.
Yes.
Councilmember Vaterlos.
Yes.
Councilmember O'Neill.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Big Stick.
Yes.
And Mayor Beer.
Yes.
And that motion passes unanimously.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you all, everyone, for your hard work. We are now adjourned.
Good night.
Good night. Have a great vacation, Tiger.
Thanks.
Thank you.